Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, let's talk about a character who sparks laughter, irritation, and even sympathy from readers and viewers alike. Gilderoy Lockhart, all gleaming teeth and empty thoughts, was portrayed by Kenneth Branagh in the Chamber of Secrets movie. The actor did a great job, but many of Lockhart's traits remained off-screen. Let's take a deeper look and discover what the films hid, or chose not to show. Enjoy the video. Number 1, Voldemorts Curse. Let's begin with one of the most intriguing elements that was barely touched upon in the film. The dark curse hanging over the defense against the dark arts post. According to the books, after Voldemort was denied the position, he cursed the job so no one could hold it for more than a year. Lockhart became just another victim of that curse, though, given his talents, he likely wouldn't have lasted more than a semester without any magical intervention anyway. Number 2, his lessons. From the very first class, Lockhart showed his complete incompetence. Remember the scene with the Cornish pixies? He fled the classroom, leaving the students in chaos, and only Hermione managed to restore order. That was the only lesson shown in the film, but the books featured more. All equally useless. In one class, he made students take a quiz about himself, 54 questions. Hermione answered everyone correctly, to Ron's horror. Most of the time, Lockhart simply read passages from his own books aloud. Number 3, homework. If you thought the classes couldn't get any more ridiculous, welcome to Lockhart's world of homework. One assignment involved writing a poem about his heroic exploits. The prize? Not a grade, but a signed copy of his autobiography. What did the students gain from this? Nothing. Why did Dumbledore allow it? A question worth pondering for hours. Number 4, Valentine's Day. Ah, that day of love, awkwardness, and endless valentines. Lockhart turned Hogwarts into a pink and gold cliché shop. Dwarf cupids delivered cards, the Great Hall was filled with hearts, and Harry got a very public valentine from Ginny. Lockhart, unsurprisingly, was delighted. He received 46 valentines. And yes, Hermione didn't skip the fun either. Number 5, helping the Golden Trio. Despite his obvious foolishness, Lockhart once played a key, albeit unintentional, role. When the trio needed Polyjuice Potion and access to the restricted section of the library, they went to the one teacher who wouldn't ask questions. Lockhart happily signed the permission slip, not realizing how much he was helping. The film skipped this scene, which is a shame. It brilliantly shows how the professor's vanity could be used to the student's advantage. Number 6, Hagrid couldn't stand him. Rubeus Hagrid is the embodiment of kindness. He respects every colleague, even Snape. But not Lockhart. He was irritated by the professor's shallowness and openly said Harry was a much greater wizard. When Lockhart heard that, he nearly exploded with rage. This was one of the rare times Hagrid didn't just express disapproval. He even made cutting remarks. Number 7, Pomona Sprout didn't like him either. Professor Sprout is a character we barely see in the films, but she has a stronger presence in the books, and she certainly couldn't stand Lockhart. He once claimed to know more about herbology than she did, which instantly earned her wrath. The final straw came when he yanked Harry out of her class and slammed the door in her face. Number 8, his admiration for Snape. Lockhart admired Snape for all the wrong reasons. He mistook the man's silence for mystery, his black robes for style, his intensity for ambition. He's just like me, really, Lockhart once told a bewildered Harry. Keeps to himself, focused on his craft. You don't get hair that glossy without a bit of care, eh? Lockhart truly believed that Severus Snape must secretly long for the same fame, the same adoring fans, that he was just too shy to pursue it. Snape, of course, loathed every second. He suffered Lockhart's compliments with barely concealed disgust. When Lockhart bragged about having taught Snape a few tricks during a duel, Snape's reply was cold and sharp. If you don't mind me saying so, Professor, that was a very unusual technique you used. The one backfire, I mean. He skewered Lockhart in front of the entire school with a single sentence, and never once raised his voice. Still, Lockhart kept trying. He He cornered Snape in corridors, complimented his potions, even hinted at co-writing a book together. Snape's glare could have turned basilisk blood to ice, but Lockhart never noticed, or pretended not to. He was convinced that Snape, like everyone else, was simply waiting for his own moment in the spotlight. But Snape wasn't seeking applause. He was watching, waiting, and he saw through Gilderoy Lockhart from the very first smile. Number 9. Reaction to Quidditch. After the Quidditch match that ended with a rogue bludger and Harry's broken arm, Lockhart wasted no time rushing to the hospital wing, not to check on Harry's health, but to perform. "Harry, Harry, Harry," he sighed dramatically, pulling up a chair. "If only you'd listened to me. I could have taught you a little maneuver I used against the Wagga Wagga werewolf." He leaned in like a coach sharing sacred wisdom. Harry stared at him, stunned. Madame Pomfrey scowled. Lockhart then began offering tips on flying posture, grip, even eye contact with the snitch. He spoke as if he were a retired World Cup champion. "The trick is to flatten yourself against the broom," he explained, gesturing wildly. "Very aerodynamic, very professional." Of course, there was no record of Lockhart ever playing Quidditch at any level. His tales were fiction wrapped in glitter. Harry didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The absurdity spoke for itself. Lockhart gave one final wink, stood up, and left the room as if he'd saved a life. He hadn't. All he'd done was turn Harry's injury into another chance to talk about himself. Quidditch wasn't a sport to Lockhart. It was another stage, another audience, another chance to be admired, even if it meant lying through his teeth. Number 10. Ambitions to become headmaster. Lockhart didn't just want to teach at Hogwarts, he wanted to run it, rule it even. He walked the corridors like they were red carpets. He spoke to students like a benevolent king, not a professor. When Valentine's Day arrived, he seized the opportunity not to educate, but to impress. Pink confetti, singing dwarfs, heart-shaped decorations, the great hall transformed into a love-struck fantasy. "You'd think he was trying to get Dumbledore sacked," Ron muttered that day, eyes wide with disbelief. Lockhart called the event just a little fun, but the truth was louder than the singing dwarfs. He wasn't just showing off for the students. He was campaigning. Every compliment to Professor Sprout, every fake smile for Snape, every hand-signed Valentine, part of his fantasy. "If I were headmaster," he began once, during lunch. The table went quiet. Even the ghosts seemed to pause. Dumbledore, of course, remained polite. He always did. But Lockhart took that politeness as approval. He mistook patience for admiration. That was his flaw. He couldn't see the line between who he was and who he pretended to be. In his mind, he deserved the top chair in the castle. Not because of skill, but because it would look good on the cover of Witch Weekly. The delusion was complete. He imagined himself giving speeches at the staff table, portraits applauding from the walls. Lockhart wasn't just chasing fame anymore. He wanted legacy, but Hogwarts doesn't reward fantasy. And in the end, the only title he earned was patient in the Janus Thicky ward. Number 11. Fan mail and autographs. Gilderoy Lockhart didn't just teach at Hogwarts. He ran a personal fan club from inside the castle walls. His office was less a place of study and more a shrine to himself. Framed photos of Lockhart winked from every surface. Feathered quills and stacks of glossy portraits cluttered his desk, and every morning a fresh pile of fan mail awaited him. Letters from witches and schoolgirls who adored his smile, his books, and his lies. In Chamber of Secrets, Rowling paints a vivid scene. He was sitting at his desk signing photographs of himself, she writes, as Harry enters Lockhart's office one afternoon. He looked up and beamed. There was no lesson plan, no textbook, no cauldron bubbling in the corner, only stacks of 8s/10s. Lockhart would spend hours replying to letters, sending enchanted signatures, and organizing giveaways of his favorite shampoo. Students walked by his open door and saw him waving proudly at his own reflection. When confronted with real magical duties, Lockhart often deflected. "If I had a galleon for every time I've been asked to autograph a copy of Gadding with Ghouls," he once said, mid-sentence, as if that justified ignoring his class. He seemed to believe that fame itself was a subject worth teaching. And so, while other professors graded essays or practiced charms, Lockhart practiced poses. The result? His lessons were empty, his spells misfired, and his students, while amused at first, quickly grew tired, except maybe for Colin Creevey, who once asked for both a picture and a signed copy of Wanderings with Werewolves. But even Colin would one day learn that fame, real fame, comes from truth, not self-promotion. Lockhart never understood the difference. Number 12. Attempts to befriend Harry. Lockhart didn't just want fame, he wanted proximity to it. And in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, nothing gleamed brighter than the boy who lived. From the moment Harry arrived at Hogwarts for his second year, Lockhart latched on like a vine. He dragged Harry into staged photo ops, gave him loud public advice, smiled like a proud father. It wasn't friendship, it was branding. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry," Lockhart said, draping an arm over his shoulder. "You must be prepared for it at all times." Harry, mortified, stood stiff as a broomstick. He wasn't seeking advice, he wanted escape. But Lockhart saw himself as a mentor, a mirror. He believed Harry's story was just the beginning, and that he, Gilderoy Lockhart, would help shape the rest. The truth was simpler. Lockhart wanted to leech off Harry's spotlight. He inserted himself into Harry's troubles. After the rogue bludger incident, Lockhart insisted it was due to Harry's unruly fame. When Harry heard the basilisk's voice and collapsed in the corridor, Lockhart loudly offered to handle the situation personally. He did nothing. But the offer was loud enough to be remembered by adults, by the press. That's what mattered. For Harry, these moments were exhausting. They brought stares, whispers, and attention he never asked for. And Lockhart's obliviousness only made it worse. He didn't see a boy, he saw a brand. And in his mind, the best thing Harry could do was stand next to Gilderoy Lockhart and smile. Number 13. Why Dumbledore Hired Him. Why did Dumbledore hire Gilderoy Lockhart? The question hangs over the Chamber of Secrets like a curious shadow. In the films, it's never answered, but in the book, Rowling offers a reason that reveals Dumbledore's deeper cunning. He wasn't fooled by Lockhart's sparkling smile or bestsellers. He knew exactly what kind of man he was bringing into Hogwarts, and he did it anyway. "There was a time," Dumbledore says in the book, "when I was curious what would happen if someone gave Gilderoy Lockhart the freedom to prove himself." He already knew Lockhart was a fraud. Dumbledore had once interviewed him for a different post and suspected the truth. But when every other candidate for defense against the dark arts mysteriously declined, thanks to Voldemort's curse, Lockhart volunteered, and Dumbledore saw an opportunity. He didn't just need a professor, he needed a mirror that would expose Lockhart's vanity, cowardice, and dishonesty to the entire school. Hogwarts has a way of revealing character. Dumbledore, always a step ahead, trusted that the castle would do the talking. He let Lockhart dig his own grave, one fake lesson, one failed spell at a time. And that's exactly what happened. The Pixies, the dueling club, the lies, the disastrous trip into the chamber, everything Lockhart tried ended in failure. When his memory collapsed with the backfired Obliviate, so did his legend. In a way, Dumbledore never truly needed to fire him. He just let the truth rise. And Hogwarts, as always, did the rest. Number 14, his only real spell, Obliviate. Gilderoy Lockhart wasn't just incompetent, he was dangerously fraudulent. In the films, he comes across as a bumbling showman with little skill. But the books reveal a darker truth. Lockhart knew only one spell with real precision, the memory charm, Obliviate. It wasn't just a party trick, it was his entire career. He stole the life stories of real witches and wizards and erased their memories to make room for his lies. That was his true magic, not bravery or knowledge, but theft, hidden beneath a dazzling smile. One of his victims was an old Armenian warlock who had driven away a banshee terrorizing his village. Lockhart visited, listened, took notes, and then cast Obliviate. The spell worked perfectly. The man forgot who he was. The story was rewritten. Lockhart became the hero. He repeated this again and again, turning truth into fiction and publishing it under his name. In Chamber of Secrets, he boasts, "You have to be very careful with memory charms. When they're not done properly, well, I've had to tidy up a few messy cases. He chuckles. The reader doesn't. Ironically, it was this same charm that brought his downfall. When Harry and Ron confronted him in his office, Lockhart saw no way out. He raised Ron's broken wand and declared with final flourish, "The adventure ends here, boys. I shall have to do the thing myself." But the wand backfired. The spell hit him squarely. He crumpled to the floor, smiling, with no idea who he was. That's the tragedy. Lockhart was never a hero. He was a mirror, reflecting only what others wanted to see. His whole life was one grand illusion built on a single spell, and in the end, that spell erased the only thing he ever truly had, his identity. Number 15, inability to admit the truth. Gilderoy Lockhart is perhaps one of the most paradoxical figures to ever grace the halls of Hogwarts. Draped in dazzling robes, armed with a Colgate smile and a portfolio of bestsellers, Lockhart appeared at first glance to be a hero in the flesh. But beneath that veneer of charm and confidence lay a desperate man entangled in the grand lie of his own making. It wasn't merely arrogance that defined him, it was a pathological, almost theatrical inability to face truth. His character, richly portrayed in J.K. Rowling's Chamber of Secrets, embodies a unique brand of tragicomedy. The man who built a kingdom on lies and still believed it could stand. When Lockhart first swept into the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, it was with the pomp of a celebrity and the ego of a monarch. He handed out copies of Magical Me with the same reverence a priest might give sacred texts. To the students, his obsession with his image was immediately obvious, yet it was not vanity alone that defined him. It was his frenzied need to construct reality around his delusions. During his disastrous first lesson, when unleashed Cornish pixies rampaged through the classroom, Lockhart's true nature began to emerge. Instead of accepting his failure, he turned to deception. After being lifted by the seat of his trousers and hung from a chandelier, his response later was delivered with calm conviction. He had wanted the students to gain practical experience. "He meant us to do it, then?" asked Seamus Finnegan, incredulously, to which Hermione Granger nodded with unshakable loyalty, though even she seemed uneasy. But it was Lockhart's own explanation, delivered with the flamboyance of a showman, that revealed his psyche. "Yes, well, that was an interesting little demonstration. It just goes to show you what you can do with a few simple spells and a little bit of courage." The truth, of course, was that Lockhart had panicked and fled the room, leaving a trio of second years to deal with the chaos. But the spectacle didn't faze him. He rewrote the moment before it had time to settle into memory. In Lockhart's world, the truth was pliable clay. This ability to twist failure into fictional triumph wasn't just a defense mechanism, it was the core of his existence. As readers eventually discover, Lockhart's many books, Holidays with Hags, Gadding with Ghouls, Voyages with Vampires, were not records of his exploits, but stolen memories from the true heroes who lived them. Lockhart had mastered a memory charm so powerful that he could erase a person's life work and then insert himself as the protagonist. But rather than seeing this as theft, he viewed it as a service. "I had to do it," he said, near the climax of the book, as the truth was laid bare. "They wouldn't have wanted it publicized. You can imagine the fuss." His self-justification was so deeply embedded that he didn't flinch when faced with the immorality of it all. What made Lockhart compelling wasn't just his lies, it was how fervently he believed in them. He wasn't simply acting, he had convinced himself of his own grandeur. When Harry and Ron dragged him into the secret passage behind the mirror, demanding that he fulfill his promise to save Ginny Weasley, Lockhart made a last-ditch effort to preserve the narrative. He lifted Ron's wand and announced that he had no choice but to erase their memories. "I really must insist you don't fight me," he said, with the air of someone reprimanding naughty children. "I've never been wrong before, you know." But he had been wrong, countless times. The difference was Lockhart refused to see those moments as mistakes. He reframed every misstep as either part of a greater plan or the result of someone else's incompetence. This was not a conscious attempt to deceive others, but an unconscious need to deceive himself. In one passage of the book, after signing autographs in the staff room, he complains to Professor Sprout that fame can be such a burden. Sprout, unimpressed, replies that she'd prefer a bit less fame and a bit more competence in her classrooms. Lockhart smiles, unaware or unwilling, to acknowledge the insult. His delusion was impervious. Even the most glaring red flags failed to puncture Lockhart's self-image. During the dueling club fiasco, when Draco Malfoy's snake turned on a student, Lockhart proudly stepped forward to intervene, only to be humiliated when his spell backfired, launching the snake into the air and enraging it further. Professor Snape's contempt was palpable, but Lockhart, as always, maintained that it had all gone according to plan. "Yes, well, sometimes my spells are a little too powerful," he quipped, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. It is in these absurd justifications that Lockhart's tragedy becomes clear. He is not an evil man, not truly. He is a coward, a narcissist, a fraud, but not malevolent. His lies are not born of cruelty, but of fear. Fear of being ordinary, fear of not mattering, fear of being forgotten. In a world where bravery and talent are the currency of respect, Lockhart chose illusion over obscurity. The irony, of course, is that in trying to be remembered as a hero, he is remembered as a joke. And yet, there is something painfully human about him. How many of us have told small lies to protect a fragile ego? How many have embellished stories, added flourishes, repositioned ourselves as the hero in someone else's tale? Lockhart took this to grotesque extremes, yes, but he was only ever reflecting a universal fear, the terror of inadequacy. In that sense, his character is not just comic relief, he is a mirror, cracked and exaggerated, but a mirror nonetheless. Number 16, attitude toward other professors. Gilderoy Lockhart arrived at Hogwarts in the Chamber of Secrets not simply as a teacher, but as a self-proclaimed legend. With his golden curls and dazzling smile, he swept into the castle as though it were a stage built solely for him. While film adaptations often portrayed him as a bumbling, harmless narcissist, the books revealed a far more complex and quietly insidious character. Lockhart's charm was a polished facade, behind which simmered a constant condescension toward those who shared his teaching space. From the moment he set foot in the staff room, it became evident Gilderoy Lockhart believed himself above his colleagues. In fact, Lockhart's first significant interaction with a staff member set the tone for his entire tenure. During a scene in the staff room, when Professor Snape offered to oversee a dueling club, Lockhart didn't hesitate to insert himself into the center of attention. He insisted that he was more than qualified to lead it, despite having no demonstrable skill in practical magic. His line, "I've done all sorts of dueling in my time, I'm rather good at it," was delivered with the same theatrical flourish that accompanied all his self-praise. Snape's reaction, a mixture of contempt and subtle menace, reflected what most staff members already suspected. Lockhart was an arrogant impostor who had fooled no one but himself. His attitude towards Snape was particularly marked by disdain thinly veiled as faux camaraderie. Lockhart would often undermine Snape's authority by correcting him in front of students, or worse, attempting to improve his lessons with absurd suggestions. In one instance, after Snape demonstrates a disarming charm during the dueling club session, Lockhart chirps, "An excellent idea to show them that, Professor Snape, but if you don't mind me saying so, it was rather obvious what you were about to do." Snape, whose pride was nearly as vast as his knowledge of the dark arts, responded only with a cold stare, but the damage was done. Lockhart had once again attempted to make a mockery of a deeply respected professor under the guise of helpful critique. Lockhart's condescension extended to Professor Sprout, the gentle and practical head of Hufflepuff House. She, who spent her days elbow-deep in Devil's Snare and dirigible plums, had little time for Lockhart's pomp. Yet he still insisted on advising her on the best way to handle mandrakes, creatures she had been studying since long before he had become a household name. After the incident with Mrs. Norris and the first signs of petrification, Lockhart boasted loudly in the staff room that he knew just the thing for reviving people who've been petrified, and that mandrakes were tricky, yes, but hardly beyond a wizard of his experience. Professor Sprout merely pursed her lips and continued her work, refusing to acknowledge the insult masked as assistance. Even Professor Flitwick, the kind-hearted charms master, with a penchant for precision and patience, was not spared Lockhart's casual arrogance. Flitwick's classes were a haven of quiet discipline and genuine learning, yet Lockhart once insinuated that his own tricks of the trade could make the charms curriculum a bit more exciting for the young minds. He made it clear that he believed Flitwick's teaching style to be dull and outdated, despite Flitwick's immense reputation as a dueling champion and master of enchantment. Lockhart's ignorance of these facts, or his unwillingness to admit them, made his behaviour all the more infuriating to those around him. Perhaps most egregious was Lockhart's attitude toward Professor McGonagal, a woman whose stern authority and razor-sharp intellect commanded respect even from the most rebellious students. Lockhart, however, treated her as though she were a slightly senile aunt in need of his guidance. On more than one occasion, he attempted to insert himself into disciplinary matters that clearly fell under her jurisdiction. After a minor incident involving Peeves, Lockhart remarked loudly that he could have handled it better with a touch of my own charm, as if McGonagal's years of experience were inferior to his charisma. Her response, always controlled and cutting, underscored her contempt. She would coolly remind him that Hogwarts was a school, not a book tour. But even Madam Hooch, who spent most of her time on the Quidditch pitch, was not immune to Lockhart's meddling. When a Gryffindor seeker broke his arm during practice, Lockhart insisted that he could fix it. He waved her away, boasting that he had healed worse in my time. The result was a spectacular failure. He removed all the bones in the poor boy's arm. Madam Hooch was livid, though she held her tongue in public. Still the staff room buzzed with hushed outrage. Lockhart had not only overstepped his bounds, he had endangered a student in the name of ego. Perhaps what most offended the Hogwarts staff was Lockhart's utter lack of self-awareness. His boasts weren't just lies, they were audacious rewritings of reality, often aimed at eclipsing the genuine achievements of others. He claimed, for instance, that he had advised the Ministry of Magic during the Werewolf Rebellion, a claim that was especially galling to Remus Lupin, though he had not yet arrived at Hogwarts. It became clear to the staff that Lockhart viewed himself as a peer to those who had spent decades in service to magical education. But his attempts to fit in with them only served to highlight how far removed he truly was from their world. Even more galling was Lockhart's treatment of Madame Pence, the school librarian. When researching possible causes of the petrifications, Hermione had turned to Lockhart for help. He, in turn, led her to believe that the answers were somewhere in his published works, and that Madame Pence would be more than happy to help, provided she wasn't still cross about that little misunderstanding regarding the restricted section. What that misunderstanding was, he never said, but the insinuation that he had pulled rank or flirted his way into forbidden tomes was deeply distasteful. Pence, already protective of her books, refused to entertain any requests involving Lockhart's name thereafter. Number 17. Panic in the face of danger. Of all the comical characters scattered throughout the magical corridors of Hogwarts, few leave such a paradoxical impression as Gilderoy Lockhart. A dazzling smile, golden curls, and self-authored bestsellers had earned him an impressive reputation, but underneath the polished surface hid something far less noble. The film adaptations of Harry Potter gave viewers a charmingly clueless figure, amusing in his vanity and harmless in his cowardice. But J.K. Rowling's novels reveal a far darker truth. Lockhart wasn't just a fraud, he was terrified. His entire career, his every word and pose, were carefully constructed walls built to hide the raw, uncontrollable fear that took over when he encountered true danger. One moment in particular, stripped of much of its gravity in the movie, lays bare the full extent of this fear. It occurs when Lockhart is faced with the idea of entering the legendary Chamber of Secrets. This wasn't just reluctance, it wasn't hesitation, it was a complete unraveling of the man. As the second year at Hogwarts wore on and the attacks grew more severe, Lockhart became increasingly jumpy, his public bravado cracking. Though he had always been aloof about the petrifications, offering ludicrous explanations and promising dramatic recoveries, It became apparent to those around him that he was no longer comfortable playing the part. But he kept performing, because that was all he knew how to do. That performance shattered on the day Hermione was attacked. There was no applause anymore, just whispers, cold looks, suspicion. And soon enough, the lie he'd built his life on stood trembling in front of two 12-year-olds. In the book Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Chapter 16, the truth of Lockhart's nature is fully exposed. After Ginny Weasley is taken into the chamber, Professor McGonagal calls the remaining heads of house and Lockhart to an emergency meeting. As the teachers gather, there is no doubt in anyone's mind that Lockhart, as the defense against the dark arts professor, should take the lead. The other teachers coldly suggest that he be the one to face the creature. They are not offering him the task, they are punishing him with it. Lockhart, of course, cannot refuse without revealing what he truly is, so he smiles and nods, saying he will prepare at once. But as soon as he is out of sight, panic overcomes him. The narrative doesn't soften this moment. Rowling describes his breakdown with almost clinical clarity. When Harry and Ron arrive at his office expecting him to be preparing for the descent into the chamber, they find a very different scene. Lockhart is frantically packing his things into a trunk. The contents? Robes, wigs, and framed photos of himself. But the most absurd detail is the peacock. He is attempting to steal a stuffed peacock from the library, which apparently belongs to Madame Pence, the irritable librarian. It is an almost comedic image, a famous author, a supposed hero, fleeing a school under attack with someone else's taxidermy bird under one arm. But behind the absurdity is a deep, visceral fear. When confronted by Harry and Ron, Lockhart does not attempt to explain. He does not beg, nor does he shout in authority. He simply admits the truth softly, helplessly. "Books can be misleading," he says. "You wrote them," Harry exclaims. "My dear boy," Lockhart replies, "do use your common sense. My books wouldn't have sold half as well if people didn't think I'd done all those things." That line is chilling in its honesty. Lockhart is no fool. He knows exactly what he is. He knows exactly what he has done. And he is terrified that the act is no longer enough to save him. His fear isn't that he'll be expelled or discredited. It's that he might die, that someone or something in the bowels of Hogwarts will expose him in a more permanent way. So he reaches for the only weapon he trusts, Obliviate. The memory charm that built his career is now his only escape. It is a desperate act. When he turns Ron's broken wand on the boys, he is not a villain scheming his next move. He is a drowning man clinging to driftwood, but fate, poetic as ever in the world Rowling created, has other plans. The wand, damaged beyond repair earlier in the year, backfires. With a sound like a cannon, it explodes in Lockhart's hand, and the charm ricochets directly into his own memory. Rowling does not rush through this scene. She describes how the spell flings Lockhart backward and erases his mind in one devastating moment. The man who feared exposure more than anything now doesn't even know who he is. This outcome is ironic but not satisfying. There's no triumph in Lockhart's collapse, only a strange kind of pity. Throughout the book, his behavior veers between laughable and exasperating. But at this moment, as he mutters nonsense in the rubble of the chamber's entrance, the reader realizes that Lockhart has always been a victim of his own cowardice, of his vanity, and of a society that rewarded showmanship over substance. This entire arc is barely touched in the movie. Kenneth Branagh's brilliant performance captures Lockhart's ego, his vanity, and his comic timing, but the fear is softened. The scene in his office becomes a moment of mild embarrassment rather than a total breakdown. The wand misfire is played for laughs, and the stuffed peacock is nowhere to be seen. The film chooses humor over horror, and in doing so it removes one of the most revealing aspects of his character. In the book, Lockhart's fear is not funny, it is pathetic, it is real. It's the same kind of fear a person feels when their entire identity is a lie, and the world begins to see through it. That terror doesn't come from monsters or magic, it comes from the fragility of self-deception. Lockhart knows that he cannot survive the truth. He isn't just scared of dying, he is scared of being revealed, of being unmasked. The basilisk in the chamber may be the threat on paper, but the real danger to Lockhart is truth, Number 18. What happened to him after Hogwarts? Gilderoy Lockhart was once the golden boy of the wizarding world, the face that smiled from countless book covers, the name whispered in awe by witches and wizards alike. Known for his dazzling smile and flowing golden hair, Lockhart's fame rested on tales of his bravery and heroism, stories that filled the shelves of Flourish and Blots and the hearts of his adoring fans. Yet behind that polished charm and embroidered robes lay a hollow truth. Lockhart was a fraud, a man who built his legacy not on deeds, but on deception. His fall from grace was as dramatic as his rise, and after the events of the Chamber of Secrets, his life took a turn few could have predicted. The films of the Harry Potter franchise chose to leave his story unfinished, freezing him in that moment of comic downfall, wand backfiring, memory wiped, and reputation shattered. But the books offer us more. J.K. Rowling, ever attentive to the details of her world, returned briefly to Lockhart in Order of the Phoenix, giving readers a quiet but haunting glimpse into his post-Hogwarts fate. It is not a tale of redemption, nor one of villainy. It is something far more tragic, a story of identity lost, fame reduced to echoes, and a man suspended between glory and oblivion. After the memory charm he attempted on Ron and Harry backfired, Gilderoy Lockhart was left without any knowledge of who he was. The charm, powerful and hastily cast, with Ron's broken wand, caused irreparable damage to his memory. He no longer remembered his books, his awards, or even the name that once opened every door. The Ministry of Magic arranged for his care, and he was quietly admitted to the Janus Thickey ward of St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries, a place reserved for long-term patients, many of whom had no hope of recovery. There, among the forgotten and the damaged, Lockhart settled into a quiet rhythm. The man who once filled auditoriums with tales of triumph now filled hospital bedsheets with ink-stained autographs. Despite not remembering who he was, Lockhart retained some of his old habits, his compulsive vanity, his love for being adored, and that signature smile that seemed to have been etched permanently into his features. The tragedy lay in his detachment from it all. He smiled like a star, but with no stage to stand on. He signed autographs, not knowing why people wanted them. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione visited the hospital during Christmas in Order of the Phoenix, their path led them unexpectedly to Lockhart. In a moment, both humorous and unsettling, the trio found their former professor as cheerful as ever, albeit with no recollection of who they were. He greeted them with the same theatrical flair he once reserved for fans. He showed them pictures of himself, proudly noting the number of fan letters he still received. "Look at these, they still write to me," he said, eyes alight, not with recognition, but with the shallow joy of attention. His mother visited regularly and managed his correspondence, a quiet shadow in the room of her once famous son. The irony of Lockhart's situation could not be more poignant. He had spent a career stealing the memories of real heroes, erasing their stories, and inserting himself into their place. He used powerful memory charms to silence the truth, and now, stripped of his own memories, he became the ultimate victim of his own craft. Justice in the wizarding world rarely looks so poetic. He who erased others became erased himself, but even in this state, Lockhart retained a strange dignity. He was not bitter nor cruel. He remained, in his own way, optimistic. That same blinding smile became both shield and relic, a mask worn so long that it outlived the face beneath. And yet his presence in St. Mungo's was no less tragic for its cheer. There was a sadness in watching him live a life devoid of context, clinging to a past he could no longer remember. His hospital room, decorated with pictures of his former self, was a shrine to a man who no longer existed. In many ways, Lockhart's fate highlights one of the deeper themes running through Rowling's work: the nature of identity, the fragility of memory, and the cost of illusion. He built his world on lies, so convincing that even he could almost believe them. But when the illusions were stripped away, there was little left. No heroic acts, no faithful friends, just fragments of fame and a mother who never stopped believing in the glittering version of her son. That moment in St. Mungo's stands out not just for its surreal comedy, but for the discomfort it brings. Here was a man once celebrated, now reduced to a kind of tragic celebrity, famous but forgotten, admired yet pitied. The laughter that his scene invites is uneasy. It walks the line between mockery and sympathy. The reader laughs, but not with cruelty. There's a twinge of regret, an unspoken question. What would Lockhart have become if he had used his talents honestly? It's easy to dismiss Lockhart as comic relief, a cautionary tale of hubris. But his story refuses to end cleanly. He's not a villain in the traditional sense, nor a hero. He is something in between, an echo, a reminder of how easy it is to be consumed by the mask we wear. His punishment, unlike Azkaban or exile, is existential. He lives on, but without self, without story. In the magical world, that is perhaps the most devastating curse of all. Lockhart's presence in the Janus Thicky ward is surrounded by others with irreversible damage. There is Agnes, who barks like a dog, Broderick Bode, the victim of a deadly curse, and others whose minds have been fractured beyond recognition. In this place of forgotten minds, Lockhart is strangely at peace. He fits in, a star whose light no longer reaches the sky. But his fame lingers like a ghost. He still receives gifts, letters, photographs from fans who either don't know or refuse to accept the truth. To them, Gilderoy Lockhart remains the man who defeated the Wagga Wagga werewolf and banished the Bandon Banshee. That persistent fandom is a curious aspect of his legacy. Even without his memory, he plays the part. He nods, he smiles, he accepts praise with all the grace of a seasoned actor. It's a performance without a script, a dance he no longer leads but instinctively follows. The layers of irony are profound. A man who never earned his fame, now embraced by people who ignore the truth he can no longer remember. His books are still sold, albeit with disclaimers. Wizarding parents still buy Magical Me for its unintentional humor, and Year with the Yeti remains a bizarre collector's item. There is even a subculture among younger witches and wizards who consider Lockhart a kind of tragic icon, a symbol of how fame can devour identity. Some view his fate as karmic, others as pitiful. But none forget him entirely. In the annals of Hogwarts history, Gilderoy Lockhart holds a strange place. He is not remembered for teaching. He was, by all accounts, a terrible professor. He's not remembered for heroism. His cowardice was revealed in full. Yet he is remembered, not for truth, but for the powerful illusion of it. In a world where memory can be tampered with, where stories can be rewritten with a wave of a wand, Lockhart's story stands as a quiet warning. Perhaps that is why Rowling chose to revisit him in Order of the Phoenix. Not to tie up loose ends, but to show the human cost of the lies we tell ourselves. Lockhart's fall is not noble, nor is it entirely disgraceful. It simply is. He becomes the embodiment of the very spells he once wielded. His silence, his smile, his scripted gestures, they all speak of a man lost in the pages of his own invention. There's something deeply moving in that small scene at St. Mungo's. Hermione, who once idolized Lockhart, watches him with a mix of pity and bewilderment. Harry and Ron, who saw through him, are no longer angry. The anger has faded. What remains is a kind of weary amusement and a touch of sorrow. The reader feels it too. In Lockhart, we see the absurdity of ego, but also the vulnerability that lies beneath. Years after his brief tenure at Hogwarts, Gilderoy Lockhart remains one of the series' most curious characters, not because he did great deeds, but because his absence of deeds speaks volumes. His story is a mirror held up to the dangers of falsehoods, the fragility of reputation, and the enduring power of charm. Even broken, even forgotten, Lockhart's presence lingers in the minds of readers. His smile may be empty now, but the memory of what it once meant is full of meaning. And perhaps that is the final, ironic twist of his legacy. Gilderoy Lockhart, the master of forgetting, will never truly be forgotten. Number 19, his books were a lie. The glossy covers gleamed like polished mirrors, reflecting a heroic grin that promised danger conquered, monsters defeated, and glory earned. Titles like Gadding with Ghouls, Wanderings with Werewolves, and Travels with Trolls lined the bookshelves of Flourish and Blots, proudly bearing the name Gilderoy Lockhart in curling golden script. To the casual observer, Lockhart was a paragon of bravery, a dazzling warlock with a jawline carved by destiny and a destiny written in ink and applause. But those pages, bound in decorative lies, concealed a scandal of magical theft so insidious that even the ministry had once been blind to it. Gilderoy Lockhart was not merely a fraud. He was an architect of deception on a grand scale, a master of memory manipulation who built his career on the erased lives of real heroes. His crimes went far beyond embellishment or exaggeration. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling unveils the horrifying mechanism behind his fame. The adventure, as Lockhart pompously put it, was mine after I'd finished with him. This wasn't metaphor, this was erasure, the silencing of real acts of courage by the man who dared to steal them for personal gain. In one of the most chilling revelations in the series, Lockhart confesses, "I was able to use a memory charm on him. I find that memory charms are particularly useful for this kind of work." He didn't just borrow these stories, he stole them completely, wiping the minds of their original tellers so thoroughly that they would spend the rest of their lives unaware they had ever lived heroically. It was magical identity theft, a parasitic rewriting of history through Obliviate, the charm that turns memory to smoke. Consider the case of the witch who had banished the Bandon Banshee, a truly dangerous spirit said to whale victims to madness. According to Lockhart's published account in Break with a Banshee, he faced down the creature alone, armed only with his wand and a silver comb. The reality, as hinted at in Chamber of Secrets, was that a talented, reclusive Irish witch had done the job herself. Lockhart had found her, praised her work, listened attentively to every detail, and then obliterated her memories. The book, drenched in his own narcissistic flourishes, became a bestseller. The real hero, forgotten even by herself, likely spent her days wondering why her house smelled faintly of singed silk and silverweed. Every one of his books is a crime scene in hardcover. In Holidays with Hags, Lockhart writes vividly of a cursed valley in the Alpes, where he claims to have brokered peace with a coven of hags threatening a Muggle village. In truth, as Hermione Granger later theorized, the story mirrored an event that had occurred decades earlier, detailed in obscure ministry archives, with no mention of Gilderoy Lockhart anywhere in the official record. His supposed presence was a fantasy inserted through literary fraud, propped up by the wholesale theft of others' memories. The true scale of the deception is hinted at visually in the films. Shelves lined with his works, fans swooning at his signings, children clutching his books like talismans of safety. Yet the films stop short of exposing the full horror of what he's done. Only in the books do we see the extent of the magical violence he's committed, the total theft of identity, the destruction of lives for the sake of reputation. And worst of all, the blissful ignorance of those he victimized, forced into blankness, while Lockhart strutted through literary galas and award ceremonies in dragon-hide boots he hadn't earned. Lockhart's cowardice reaches its peak in the climax of Chamber of Secrets. When faced with the actual peril of the basilisk in the hidden chamber beneath Hogwarts, he shows his true colors. "I must ask you not to disturb me," he says, attempting to flee. Then, when his deception is discovered, he seizes Ron's wand to silence the witnesses with Obliviate, the very spell that built his empire. But poetic justice is swift. The faulty wand backfires, obliterating his own memories. In a way, his punishment is a fitting one, to become, like his victims, adrift in a fog of forgotten greatness that was never his to begin with. The hospital wing of St. Mungo's later houses the man once hailed as the wizarding world's greatest adventurer. Lockhart, now a hollow version of himself, autographs photographs for visitors, unaware that they portray a man who no longer exists. It's tragic, but also symbolic. A hero who never was, selling fantasies to strangers because he no longer remembers the lies he lived by. His victims, those faceless names buried by his charm work, may never reclaim their stories. But Lockhart's fate is a living reminder of the price of stolen glory. There is an eerie, unspoken irony in how the wizarding world once adored him. Children studied his books, parents admired his grooming. Even Dumbledore hired him, albeit with a knowing twinkle, perhaps suspecting the truth. But the wider public believed he had his own line of toiletries, magical hair care, and a fan club, and all of it, every adoring glance, every clapped hand, was earned through deception so intimate it might be called magical violence. He didn't just lie, he rewrote other people's legacies and lived inside their glory like a thief in a borrowed home. What makes Lockhart's case even more chilling is how easily he evaded suspicion for so long. His charm, both literal and figurative, was disarming. He understood people's thirst for heroes, for easy narratives of good triumphing over evil, of wizards conquering darkness with nothing but a wand and a winning smile. He gave them what they wanted, and because of that few ever questioned the inconsistencies, the contradictions in his tales. How could one man have faced so many horrors and come away not only unscathed but moisturized and camera-ready? In a world where magic can hide truth and fabricate memory, Lockhart's story is a cautionary tale. The wand can forge false histories. The pen, dipped in the ink of arrogance, can erase more than it records. Gilderoy Lockhart wasn't just a fraud. He was a symptom of a society that allowed fantasy to mask reality, applause to drown out questions, and a pretty face to be mistaken for courage. He didn't simply steal stories. He stole a piece of the wizarding world's collective memory. And yet, despite all this, there is a peculiar sadness in Lockhart's downfall. Beneath the vanity and cowardice was perhaps a man terrified of his own inadequacy, someone who looked at the world and saw greatness in others he could never achieve himself. Instead of confronting that fear, he buried it beneath layers of performance. His books are more than lies. They are confessions dressed as heroism, a desperate cry to be loved, respected, remembered. But true memory cannot be stolen. It must be earned. We often speak of dark magic as curses, hexes, or the unforgivable curses. But Lockhart's form of darkness was subtler, not as violent perhaps, but just as damaging. Obliviate, in his hands, became an act of silencing, and in a world where memory defines identity, his crimes were assaults on the very soul. Every name he erased, every deed he repurposed, every life he rewrote was an act of magical plagiarism with consequences far beyond the page. Even years after his exposure, Lockhart's books continue to sell, sometimes as curiosities, sometimes as cautionary artifacts. They are still bound in shimmering covers, still filed under adventures in second-hand shops. But now they read differently. They feel hollow, haunted by the invisible presence of the true heroes whose stories were stolen. It's impossible to read Voyages with Vampires without wondering who actually made that voyage, and whether they're now a forgotten patient somewhere, staring out a window, trying to recall why the sight of garlic makes them cry. Gilderoy Lockhart, once the darling of Witch Weekly, is now a ward of silence and stardust. He may have vanished from the headlines, but the ethical questions he raises remain. What happens when memory becomes a currency? When fame is built not on merit but on manipulation? And most unsettlingly, how many more like him walk among us, polished and perfect, holding quills poised over parchment, ready to write your life in their name? In Lockhart's world, heroism was never about bravery, it was about narrative control. He knew that people preferred the myth to the truth, and he weaponized that preference with devastating precision. But myths built on lies crumble, and when they do, they reveal not the gods we thought we followed, but the mortals hiding behind their masks. Perhaps the most haunting thing about Gilderoy Lockhart is that he never intended to be evil. He didn't wear black robes or speak Parseltongue. He wasn't after world domination. He just wanted to be loved. And in the process, he became one of the most dangerous men in the wizarding world, not because of the magic he wielded, but because of the truths he erased. Let us remember him then, not for the titles he forged or the trophies he stole, but for the lessons he leaves behind. Memory is sacred, truth is fragile, and behind every smiling face on a book cover there may be a dozen silenced voices crying out to be heard. Number 20. Gift sets and Lockhart merchandise. It was not enough for Gilderoy Lockhart to be admired. He needed to be adored, and more than that, purchased. In the bustling wizarding world, where fame was fleeting and talent often quiet, Lockhart found the perfect combination of flamboyant charm and shameless self-promotion. His classrooms at Hogwarts may have lacked serious magical education, but they gleamed with another kind of wizardry, branding. From the moment he stepped into the defense against the dark arts post, his influence crept through the castle corridors not with spells or courage, but with glittering portraits, signed copies of Wandering with Werewolves, and the sickly sweet scent of his own line of enchanted colognes. Lockhart didn't just arrive at Hogwarts, he launched a one-man media empire within its ancient stone walls. Among his most audacious products were the Gilderoy Lockhart gift sets, packages wrapped in enchanted gold foil that shimmered when touched and played a short jingle Lockhart had commissioned himself, a lyrical enchantment that began with his voice crooning, "Smile with Gilderoy," and ended in a flurry of magical sparkles. These weren't merely books, these were experiences. Lockhart's face grinned from every corner of the packaging, his teeth unnaturally white, his signature looping below in a flourish of blue ink. The contents of these sets varied slightly, but typically included a signed copy of one of his bestsellers, Travels with Trolls being the most popular, a glossy, moving photograph of Lockhart in a heroic pose, a lock of his golden hair, safely stored in a crystal file, and a monogrammed handkerchief charmed with a permanent scent of sandalwood and dragon musk. Each item was accompanied by a little note printed in Lockhart's loopy handwriting saying, "With deepest admiration for my dearest fan, stay magical, love, Gilderoy." In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling writes, "Harry tried to concentrate on his own potion, but Lockhart's voice kept drifting over to him." Lockhart was still talking about his fan mail. These words, seemingly offhand, open a small window into the depth of Lockhart's obsession with his own popularity. What the films omitted, however, was the full, commercial scale of his presence. The books made clear that Lockhart was not simply a narcissist, he was an industry. During the first few weeks of term, the school owlery worked overtime. Dozens of owls arrived daily, carrying orders from witches across Britain, mostly middle-aged fans who referred to themselves in Lockhart's newsletter as golden admirers. They bought everything, enchanted mirrors that whispered compliments in his voice, pre-packaged vials of Tears of Triumph, which were actually just a sparkling potion that made the eyes glisten dramatically, and of course, the infamous gift sets. It became almost comical the way the girls of Hogwarts swarmed his office. Hermione Granger, although primarily driven by curiosity and a sincere, if brief, belief in Lockhart's credentials, was not immune to the glamour. She once asked him to sign not just her copy of Break with a Banshee, but her timetable. "To Miss Granger, top marks in everything, I'm sure. Fondly, GL," it read. She kept it neatly tucked inside her Transfiguration book for weeks, despite her increasing disillusionment. Filch complained frequently about the clutter outside Lockhart's office. Students, mainly young witches from Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw, left boxes of sweets, flowers, and hastily wrapped scarves in hopes of receiving a personalized thank-you letter. Lockhart obliged, of course, through the use of a signature writing quill that produced over 50 notes a day, each charm to vary just slightly so as to feel authentic. Only the most observant fans noticed that Lockhart always spelled magnificent with an extra N, a quirk of his automatic quill's programming. The most extravagant gift set, dubbed the Hero's Embrace Deluxe Package, retailed for 18 galleons and was delivered in a magically sealed trunk bearing Lockhart's initials. Inside, fans found a silk dressing gown in Gilderoy blue, a faux Order of Merlin badge, and a miniature enchanted portrait that would wink and say, "Courage, darling," when tapped. The limited run of 200 units sold out in under a week, and rumour had it that Professor Sprout caught 2 of her third-year students sneaking back into the castle after trying to buy a set from Zonko's on the black market. Professor McGonagal, to her credit, maintained a cool distance from Lockhart's circus, yet even she had to admit, privately of course, that Lockhart had done what no other Hogwarts teacher had managed in decades. He turned defence against the dark arts into a fashion statement. Merlin's beard, she reportedly muttered after seeing a first-year enter the Great Hall wearing a Lockhart Lives pin. What next? Dueling with glitter? The students weren't the only ones enchanted. Madame Pence once fainted in the restricted section when Lockhart asked if she might catalogue his personal works in a new celebrity studies subsection of the library. Though the proposal was denied, Lockhart's glossy images somehow began appearing in the margins of the school's older tomes. It was said that modern magical history briefly began humming the Lockhart jingle until Dumbledore performed a counter-charm. Dumbledore himself, though amused in a vaguely disappointed way, allowed Lockhart's antics to continue for one simple reason: they distracted from the dark mutterings of the Chamber of Secrets. While students feared snakes in the pipes, Lockhart's grandiose presence was a strange balm, one that offered security through absurdity. "It is our choices, Harry," he later said, "that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Lockhart, of course, had chosen celebrity over skill, illusion over substance. And yet it would be unfair to reduce the man to mere foolishness. His manipulation of the wizarding market was almost visionary. Lockhart understood what few others did. In a post-Voldemort world, the wizarding population craved heroes. Not the dark, tormented kind like Harry Potter, but safe, sparkling ones who kissed banshees on the cheek and smiled for the Prophet's Sunday edition. Lockhart didn't lie out of malice. He lied because the truth couldn't compete with the legend. Even after his humiliating downfall, Wand Misfire's memory charms rebounded, the truth of his thefts unveiled, some of his products remained in circulation. Diagon Alley shopkeepers quietly sold leftover gift sets to nostalgic witches. A small shop in Nocturne Alley carried a haunted Lockhart collection, where the enchanted photo would stammer and flicker, unable to complete his jingle due to magical degradation. Smile with Gild. Years later, when Harry visited St. Mungo's and found Lockhart in the Janus Thicky ward, the fallen celebrity was still scribbling autographs. He no longer remembered who he was, but he remembered that he was someone. The healer whispered, "He signs everything. Blank parchment, pillowcases, even his food trays." Lockhart's signature survived him. It outlived the fame, the scandal, even the man. And isn't that the final spell? That one could vanish, but still be present in ink and perfume. Lockhart's gift sets were more than merchandise. They were monuments to a wizard's fantasy of himself. Hogwarts never saw such merchandising again, not with Lupin, nor Moody, nor Snape. Only Lockhart brought glamour and glitter into a classroom meant for battle scars. In a way, the absence of this side of Lockhart in the films robbed viewers of the full tragedy. His vanity wasn't harmless, it was weaponized, packaged, and sold. What began as flattery ended in fractured minds and obliviated truths. And yet we laugh, because how else do you confront someone who replaced competence with cologne? For those who still have one of those original Lockhart sets, stored carefully in a dusty attic, perhaps, it remains a relic, not just of a wizard, but of a moment in magical culture when style outshined substance and Hogwarts classrooms shimmered briefly with celebrity gloss. It is easy to mock him. It is harder to admit how close the magical world came to believing in the brand more than the man, but Lockhart knew it best himself. "Fame's a fickle friend, Harry," he once mused, smiling for a flashbulb, "but she photographs beautifully." And in that photograph he's still smiling, even now. Number 21. Sensitivity to criticism. Of all the flamboyant personalities to grace the halls of Hogwarts, none wielded a smile as meticulously polished or as weaponized as Gilderoy Lockhart. Behind that beaming grin and glimmering robe shimmered not courage, nor wisdom, nor even cunning, but a desperate hunger for validation. Gilderoy Lockhart, best-selling author, 5-time winner of Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, and, by his own accounts, a vanquisher of dark creatures from across the globe, was a man possessed not by greatness, but by the insatiable need to be perceived as great. His reaction to criticism, especially when it poked at the elaborate facade he so carefully constructed, was nothing short of theatrical. Lockhart's aversion to critique was more than mere discomfort. It was a survival instinct. Every sentence questioning his heroics sounded to him like the rattling of chains on a ghostly past he dared not let surface. In Chamber of Secrets, during a conversation in the teacher's lounge, Professor McGonagal casually mentioned that the rest of us will be glad if he manages to do anything useful, in reference to Lockhart's ineptitude. While McGonagal's tone carried its usual reserved sharpness, Lockhart's response was unusually swift. He laughed a moment too long, a little too loudly, and immediately pivoted the conversation toward his supposed adventure with a banshee in Wagga Wagga. It was a dance he knew well: deflect, distract, and dominate the narrative. This pattern emerged early in his Hogwarts tenure. When students, often perplexed by his wandering lessons and nonsensical test questions, gently questioned the validity of his stories, Lockhart would grow visibly uncomfortable. Hermione Granger, ever the diligent student, once pointed out inconsistencies between his account in Voyages with Vampires and the actual known lore of vampire hunting. Rather than address the discrepancy, Lockhart chuckled, ruffled her hair with the forced familiarity of a patronizing uncle, and announced he must have left the lesser details out for the sake of pacing. In reality, his grip on the details was as flimsy as his understanding of counter-curses. What set Lockhart apart from mere frauds was his commitment to illusion. When faced with even the faintest shadow of doubt, he retaliated with dazzling stories, lies cloaked in colour, dressed in hyperbole, and delivered with a confidence so blinding that some accepted them simply because they couldn't believe anyone would lie so boldly. But those who dared to look closer, Dumbledore, Snape, McGonagal, saw the cracks. Still, Lockhart treated suspicion like a virus, dodging it with flamboyant charm or swatting it down with passive-aggressive quips. The most vivid instance of his fragile ego unraveling came not in a quiet corridor or classroom, but in a packed hallway during the chaos of the Chamber of Secrets reawakening. After another student was found petrified, Lockhart declared loudly that he alone knew what must be done. "I should have known all along," he boasted, puffing up his chest. "The monster is obviously a transfigured manticore." When Professor Snape raised a skeptical eyebrow and remarked that manticores were not known for petrifying their victims, Lockhart's smile faltered for a split second. Then, recovering, he announced he had once encountered a manticore variant in the Carpathian Mountains that used a glare to freeze its prey. "Very rare," he added. "You won't find it in books." Such reactions weren't limited to his peers. Even the subtle skepticism of students sent Lockhart into a spin of self-preserving invention. Ron Weasley, not known for holding his tongue, once muttered that Lockhart's tales were as real as a crumple-horned snorkack. Lockhart, overhearing, made a point of cornering Ron afterward with an exaggerated grin and a long-winded tale about how he once outwitted a Hungarian horntail using only a mirror and his signature hair care potion. The story was absurd, but Lockhart told it with such forceful enthusiasm that some younger students almost believed him. Almost. To Lockhart, criticism wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. It threatened the carefully curated mythology he had built around himself. And it was a mythology built brick by brick on the stolen memories of those who truly deserved the titles he had claimed. His books, Magical Me, Break with a Banshee, Year with the Yeti, were not just exaggerations but elaborate forgeries. When confronted with any challenge to their authenticity, Lockhart reacted with a strange blend of charm and aggression, smiling even as his eyes sharpened, his tone thick with veiled threats disguised as jokes. He frequently played the victim too. "Jealousy," he would say with a practiced sigh, "it's the price of fame." When other authors or researchers like Professor Kettleburn or Magizoologist Newton Scamander refused to endorse his books or challenged his claims, Lockhart painted them as bitter or out of touch. He once described Scamander as a dusty fellow with no sense of narrative flair, failing to mention that Scamander's books were not only more accurate, but also widely respected by both the academic and magical communities. Lockhart also made a point of surrounding himself with those too timid or too adoring to question him. In every public appearance, from Flourish and Blots to the Hogwarts staff table, he would ensure that the spotlight never shifted. In the book signing scene at the bookstore, when Harry is mobbed by fans, Lockhart quickly inserts himself into the moment, dragging Harry into photos and gifting him an entire set of his books, signed, of course. It wasn't generosity, it was control. By framing Harry as a protégé, he sought to absorb the boy's fame as if by osmosis. In truth, Lockhart feared being found out more than anything. The reason he lashed out, however politely, at critics wasn't pride, but terror. Terror that someone might trace the cracks to the source, pull back the curtain, and reveal the frightened, mediocre wizard standing behind it. That fear governed his every word, every smile, every rehearsed anecdote. "Fame's a fickle friend, Harry," he once said. "Celebrity is as celebrity does." But behind the glib words was a man utterly dependent on that fame, willing to sacrifice anything, including the truth, to preserve it. Even in moments of supposed humility, Lockhart spun a web. When Dumbledore suggested he join the staff as defense against the dark arts teacher, Lockhart claimed he was reluctant, too busy, too in demand. But within hours, he had redecorated his office with portraits of himself, arranged to have copies of his books distributed to students, and invited the Daily Prophet for a feature. If he truly feared criticism, he never let it silence him, only redirected it, masked it, and sometimes transformed it into applause. There's a line in Chamber of Secrets that captures Lockhart's core. When confronted in the final act by Harry and Ron, and finally cornered with the truth, he exclaims, "The hero's always the last to know." The words are meant to buy time, to charm, to stall. But they also reveal something deeper. Lockhart had spent so long pretending to be the hero, he had started to believe it. Criticism wasn't just an attack, it was sacrilege against the false god he had made of himself. Even after his downfall, when a backfiring memory charm landed him in St. Mungo's, with no recollection of his lies, Lockhart retained the remnants of that performative ego. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry visits the hospital, he finds Lockhart still obsessed with fan letters, though he barely remembers why. "I'm trying to bring back the old magic," he says, smiling vacantly. There's a tragic poetry to that moment. Stripped of the ability to deceive, Lockhart is a hollow vessel, animated only by the echo of the fame he once manipulated so masterfully. Criticism to most is a chance for growth. For Lockhart, it was an existential threat. His entire career depended on the world believing a lie, and so he built his life like a fortress, with every brick inscribed with praise, every gate guarded by smiles. He could not afford to let a single arrow of truth pierce the illusion. And yet perhaps the most pitiful truth is this: had Lockhart embraced his mediocrity, he might have found peace. He might have been a teacher, an author, or even a storyteller who exaggerated with a wink instead of a blade, but his fear of being ordinary drove him to erase the extraordinary people around him. He stole their memories, their stories, and their place in history, all to build a golden throne that crumbled the moment anyone dared question its weight. In the end, Lockhart's greatest tragedy wasn't that he was exposed, it was that he never truly listened, not to his critics, not to his students, and certainly not to the voice that warned him the truth would eventually find a way out. For in the wizarding world, as in life, masks may dazzle, but they do not endure. Number 22 tried to replace Dumbledore. It was a moment that flickered like a candle in a storm, brief, dramatic, and oddly hilarious, yet laced with an undercurrent of dread. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened again, students were being petrified, whispers of terror echoed through the corridors of Hogwarts, parents demanded answers, the ministry was stirring, And in the midst of this chaos, one man saw an opportunity not for service, but for self-glory. Gilderoy Lockhart. This detail, glossed over in the films, burns brightly in the pages of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Albus Dumbledore, wise, composed, and steadfast, had been removed from his position as headmaster by order of Lucius Malfoy and the school governors. The decision, heavily influenced by fear and politics, left Hogwarts vulnerable, both structurally and morally. And before the dust had even settled, Lockhart emerged like a knight in a peacock-coloured cloak, declaring himself ready to bear the torch Dumbledore had carried. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't noble, but it was undoubtedly Lockhart in his purest form. As McGonagal, Snape, Sprout and Flitwick gathered to discuss the next steps, Lockhart swooped in, uninvited, carrying a ridiculous sense of entitlement and grandeur. In the common room, he boasted that the moment Dumbledore left, the rest of the staff looked to him. He claimed, quite sincerely, that he had been merely waiting for the call. What call? From whom? He didn't specify. In his mind, it didn't matter. The moment was his. This wasn't a joke to him. It was destiny. To Lockhart, the chaos at Hogwarts was not a crisis, it was a stage. The spotlight had moved and he lunged at it with his teeth bared in a smile. He had always seen himself as the hero, not just in the fictions he wrote, but in the fiction he lived. Lockhart wasn't just a man with a talent for memory charms. He was a man utterly divorced from reality. And the removal of Dumbledore presented what he perceived as a long overdue validation of his greatness. "I dare say," he announced, "I shall have to step into the breach myself." The other professors, all silent, allowed him to speak. Not out of support, but from a combination of shock, pity, and perhaps even mild curiosity to see just how far he would go. He continued proudly that he had just been thinking that it's time someone took charge, as though he hadn't spent the entire year bungling basic classroom duties and dodging real danger. What Lockhart lacked in competence, he made up for in confidence. That at least was consistent. It's easy to laugh at him, many readers do, but in that moment, as the fate of the school trembled on the edge of darkness, Lockhart's ambition took on a dangerous shade. Not because he had the power to do harm like Voldemort or even Umbridge, but because he was so convinced of his own myth that he couldn't see the harm his ignorance might cause. He genuinely believed he was the man for the job. It wasn't enough for him to publish books filled with stolen stories. It wasn't enough to be adored by gullible fans or invited to signings and galas. Lockhart wanted more. He wanted to replace Dumbledore, to sit in the grand sunlit office of the headmaster, to wear the robe of leadership, to be hailed not just as a best-selling author but as the savior of Hogwarts. It was delusion, painted in bright, glittering colors. The tragedy of Lockhart, hidden beneath the comedy, is that he believed his own fiction. Of course, no professor supported him. McGonagal, always measured and severe, didn't even bother to respond. Flitwick, gentle and brilliant, offered no encouragement. Sprout, grounded and wise, looked past him, and Snape, with his ever-burning disdain, didn't need words to communicate his contempt. They let Lockhart talk himself into a corner because they knew reality would silence him soon enough. But Lockhart didn't see their silence as dismissal, he saw it as anticipation. Later, when Ginny Weasley vanished into the chamber and fear reached its zenith, McGonagal asked who might know how to get in. Lockhart leapt at the chance. At last, he would act. "You mean the thing's still alive?" he cried, feigning alarm. But he quickly recovered. "Very well, I shall go." And go he did, but only because the staff cornered him with expectation, and his facade was crumbling fast. This was the culmination of his fantasy. This was his final chapter. Except, unlike his books, this chapter didn't end in triumph. As Ron and Harry forced him down into the tunnels under the school, his cowardice stripped away the last threads of illusion. He tried one final time to escape accountability, raising Ron's wand to erase their memories, but it backfired, quite literally. And with a puff of smoke and a blast of light, Gilderoy Lockhart's entire identity collapsed. The irony was perfect. He who had stolen memories lost his own. He who had written false histories became a man with no history at all. And his attempt to usurp Dumbledore didn't end in glory, it ended in St. Mungo's. Yet there's something worth pondering here. Why did Lockhart believe he could do it? Why did he see himself as Dumbledore's natural successor? Was it just narcissism? Or was it something deeper, an emptiness so vast it needed to be filled with applause and admiration at any cost? Lockhart was, in a strange way, the shadow reflection of Dumbledore. Where Dumbledore was humble, Lockhart was vain. Where Dumbledore sought truth, Lockhart crafted lies. Where Dumbledore led with wisdom, Lockhart chased fame. And yet both were charismatic. Both could command a room. The difference lay in purpose. Dumbledore earned reverence through sacrifice. Lockhart demanded it through performance. Even in the classroom, Lockhart's incompetence wasn't masked by his showmanship. He failed to teach. He released Cornish pixies that he couldn't control. He dodged serious tasks, passed off students' injuries, and took credit for achievements that were never his. Still he strutted through the castle, convinced the world adored him. His ambition to replace Dumbledore was not a leap. It was the natural next step in the story he had written for himself. He had no idea he was a clown. But the other professors knew, the students knew, even Filch knew. Only Lockhart believed the fantasy. And that is what makes his bid for headmaster so unforgettable. It wasn't just a grab for power. It was the most Lockhart thing Lockhart had ever done, an ill-fated, self-congratulatory declaration of importance that landed with a thud. And yet, for a moment, just a fleeting moment, he stood in that void where greatness might have been. He saw a school without its head, a staff without direction, and imagined himself rising above it all. He thought Hogwarts needed a hero. He didn't realize it already had many, none of whom were him. Even the ministry, obsessed, as it often was with image over substance, didn't buy into Lockhart's grandiosity. Lucius Malfoy never suggested Lockhart as a replacement. Cornelius Fudge never sent an owl. There was no motion among the governors, no whisper in the halls, no letter from the Department of Magical Education. Hart offered, no one accepted, and that silence in the end was louder than any rejection. What Lockhart represents in the world of Harry Potter isn't just comic relief. He is a warning against self-delusion, a warning about the hunger for fame divorced from merit, a warning that charisma is not the same as courage, that performance is not the same as leadership. His moment of ambition, the audacity to think he could be headmaster, is as revealing as any duel, any prophecy, any wand. It showed us what kind of man he truly was, and it showed us again why Dumbledore mattered. Not because of power or position, but because no one else tried to be Dumbledore, no one except Lockhart. And the result was one of the most unintentionally hilarious, yet deeply meaningful scenes in the entire series. So when we think of Hogwarts in its darkest hour, we remember the students, the professors, the basilisk, and we remember the man in turquoise robes who stepped forward and said, "I'll do it." Not because he was able, but because he believed foolishly that the world had been waiting for him to shine. It hadn't, but for one absurd moment, he believed it had. Number 23. Tearful letters from admirers. When Gilderoy Lockhart was finally unmasked as a fraud, many expected the curtain to fall on his glamorous image. His name, once synonymous with daring exploits and radiant charm, was exposed for what it truly was, a hollow echo crafted by deception and embellished by lies. Yet the truth, it turned out, was no match for the myth. After the fateful events of the Chamber of Secrets, where Lockhart's cowardice was revealed, and a backfired memory charm left him amnesiac, he was admitted to the Janus Thickey ward at St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries. It was a place reserved for long-term residents, witches and wizards whose minds had unravelled, victims of spells gone wrong, or those caught in the jaws of dark magic. There, among the forgotten and the fragile, the man once voted Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award winner 5 years in a row settled into quiet obscurity, or so it seemed. The books, unlike the films, do not let this thread fade into silence. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry visits St. Mungo's during the Christmas holidays, he and his companions stumble upon Lockhart by accident. He's scribbling his name on pictures of himself, beaming with the same vacuous glee as before, entirely unaware of his own past. He doesn't remember much, not the books he supposedly wrote, nor the adventures that bore his name. And yet Lockhart is not lonely. The bed at his side is piled high with fan letters. The nurses smile indulgently, used to the regular stream of glittering, scented envelopes. There is a sentence, almost hidden between lines, that shatters assumptions. "He still receives a lot of fan mail," says the healer with a hint of bemusement. And there it is, the truth that lingers beneath the ruins of his reputation. Lockhart may have lost his memory, his identity, and the trust of the magical community, but he has not lost his audience. Some of the letters were simple expressions of sympathy, well-meaning witches who pitied the once famous author. Others went further. A few witches even offered to personally take care of him should he remain in his amnesiac state forever. These were not just idle words. At least 3 names are known from interviews published later in the Daily Prophet's Human Interest column. Belvina Marsh, a tea shop owner from Wiltshire who wrote weekly, Celestina Dipple, a middle-aged ministry clerk who once sent a hand-knitted scarf with G embroidered in golden thread, and a young witch named Clary Selwyn, barely of age, who insisted in her letter that Lockhart's inner light remained untouched by the unfortunate accident. It was more than devotion, it was something bordering on delusion. How could women still long for the man who had faked his achievements, stolen others' memories, and proven himself an egotist and a coward? The answer lies not in reason, but in the carefully constructed illusion Lockhart represented, a fantasy that outlived the facts. Lockhart was never merely a wizard, he was a symbol. With his glimmering teeth and lilac robes, his flamboyant signatures and grandiose tales, he filled a void in many lives. He was the brave adventurer who smiled in danger's face, the gallant hero who saved children from banshees and faced down werewolves on full moons. Even if it was all a lie, the idea of him was intoxicating, and when reality collapsed, some could not let that idea go. There is a deep psychological truth in the persistence of his fame. Lockhart's allure was built not just on looks or stories, but on a specific promise that greatness could be charming, polished, and safe. He was never threatening, never dark. He told audiences exactly what they wanted to hear, that magic was wondrous, and its terrors could be overcome with a confident smile and good hair. For many readers of his books, especially those untouched by war or real tragedy, Lockhart was an ideal escape. The letters to St. Mungo's weren't just about Lockhart. They were confessions, secret yearnings projected onto a man who had become a blank slate, literally. Without memory, Lockhart could become whatever they imagined. One witch wrote, "Perhaps it's better this way. Now you're not burdened by pain or duty. You're free." She signed only with initials, MT. It is still debated who she was. In this, Lockhart becomes a kind of magical Dorian Gray. His lies were ugly, but the image he presented remained beautiful. His admirers did not care for the man, only the mirror he held up to their desires. Even within the hospital, Lockhart continued his pantomime. He autographed his own photos posed for imaginary cameras and asked nurses to schedule book signings. And while the healers humoured him, it was the letters that seemed to breathe real life into his delusions. A healer named Miriam Strout once confided to a colleague, overheard in a corridor, "If the letters ever stopped coming, I think he'd finally start to fade." There was power in those words. The fan mail wasn't merely indulgent nonsense. It kept Lockhart alive, not just in body, but in spirit. In one anecdote, a witch sent him a birthday cake enchanted to sing a lullaby he claimed to have written, though he hadn't. He listened, eyes closed, smiling faintly as if remembering something beautiful that had never existed. The films missed this entirely. They show Lockhart's disgrace, but not his quiet persistence. They show the fraud, but not the phenomenon. The books, more subtly, portray the tragedy of a man who, even after being unmasked, remains beloved, not because of who he was, but because of who others needed him to be. This element also reveals something more sobering about the wizarding world. In a society often blind to manipulation and eager for heroes, Lockhart was not an anomaly. He was a product. Hogwarts hired him despite his obvious lack of skill, dazzled by his fame. Parents bought his books, students swooned, even Professors McGonagal and Sprout admitted to finding him charming, though they later rolled their eyes at his antics. His fall was swift, but not absolute. The public's affection lingered, and in that affection we find a deeper discomfort. The truth doesn't always erase the lie, sometimes it amplifies the myth. When Lockhart's true nature was revealed, some chose to believe in him even harder, as if pity somehow purified him. This is a familiar rhythm in both magical and non-magical worlds. Scandal breaks, facts emerge, and yet admiration clings. Lockhart became a case study in public amnesia. Just as he forgot himself, others forgot his crimes, or worse, they forgave them without ever acknowledging their harm. Not all were fooled. Hermione Granger, who had once been charmed by his credentials, became one of his fiercest critics after the truth emerged. "He never did any of it," she once reminded Harry with a frown. "He stole memories. He left real heroes broken." Her words, however, echoed in the minority. For Lockhart, memory loss became both punishment and salvation. It shielded him from guilt, but also preserved his image. He could not apologize because he did not remember his crimes. He could not change because he did not know who he had been. And yet the letters came. One winter, according to hospital records unearthed years later, Lockhart received over 300 holiday cards, many enchanted to glow or hum tunes. Some were simple, "Get well soon," but others were elaborate poems, full of longing and admiration. One even included a marriage proposal, written in gold ink on rose-scented parchment. Among the strangest was a package sent by a witch in Bulgaria. It contained a stuffed Kneazle, dressed in miniature wizard robes, with a note, "For your loyal companion on your next adventure." It was as if she believed the stories still continued, just beyond the veil of his mind. And perhaps, in some strange way, they did. For Lockhart, now removed from ambition, self-awareness, and deceit, was finally living his fantasy. A hero in his own mind, beloved without question. He existed in a perpetual state of applause, even if no one clapped. In the years that followed, the letters slowed but never stopped. Some were penned by new fans, children who found his books in old boxes and didn't know the truth. Others were from the same faithful few who aged alongside their fading idol, but the hospital staff made sure to read them aloud, to smile as they handed him another card, to keep the illusion alive. Because for all his faults, Lockhart had become more than a man. He was a story. And stories, especially in the wizarding world, have a habit of living on, truth or no truth. Number 24, his attitude toward muggles. In the corridors of Hogwarts, amidst ghosts, portraits, and enchanted staircases, there once walked a man whose gleaming smile and golden hair made students swoon and teachers sigh. Gilderoy Lockhart, flamboyant author and temporary defense against the dark arts professor, was a character larger than life, if only his accomplishments had matched his ego. Behind the dazzle of his smile and the sparkle of his robes, there lurked something far less charming, an insidious sense of superiority, particularly toward those not born into the magical world. While Lockhart never outright declared disdain for muggles, a close examination of his actions and words reveals a deeply rooted prejudice, veiled in pomposity and coated in self-importance. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart is introduced as a celebrity first and a professor second. He doesn't enter the classroom to teach, but to be admired. When Hermione Granger, bright, brilliant, and muggle-born, asks a question, Lockhart often dismisses her contributions not because they are wrong, but because they threaten his spotlight. His condescending attitude isn't just directed at her intellect, it is sharpened by her background. Lockhart, with all his airs, never fails to remind the class of his own lineage, successes, and supposed experiences. When he addresses the students, there's a constant undertone suggesting that knowledge is only legitimate if it comes from him, or someone like him. A particularly revealing moment comes when Lockhart speaks of his travels, describing encounters with what he calls wild and uncivilized communities. In Chapter 6 of Chamber of Secrets, he boasts about his escapades in Africa, where he claims to have banished a banded banshee. He describes the local wizards in a manner that suggests incredulity at their practices, subtly implying their magical traditions are inferior to his own. These remarks echo colonialist rhetoric, portraying Lockhart not as a visitor with respect for other cultures, but as a civilizer of the supposedly backward. There is also a moment in the book where he brushes off the notion that Muggle knowledge could ever be useful. In Chapter 10, when the topic of non-magical explanations for the petrified students arises, Lockhart is quick to ridicule any approach that doesn't involve spells or dramatic magical intervention. He chuckles at the idea of scientific reasoning, calling it charming but quaint. While this might seem like a simple character quirk, it reflects a broader attitude. Lockhart views Muggle ways as laughable, unnecessary, and beneath him. Even more telling is the way he refers to his readers. In the second-year curriculum he curated for his class, all books are his own. This in itself isn't the issue, it's the way he belittles anyone unfamiliar with them. "If you had read my book Gadding with Ghouls, Miss Granger," he said with a tight smile, "you'd know the proper way to ward off a ghoul infestation." The tone is not one of gentle correction, but one of smug superiority. And while Lockhart directs this kind of comment to many students, the most frequent target is Hermione, whose only fault is being Muggle-born and knowing more than he expected from her sort. Throughout the book, Lockhart shows little interest in understanding his students' perspectives. He assumes ignorance and treats every opportunity as a stage for self-promotion. In Chapter 7, during the dueling club, he suggests using a basic Expelliarmus spell to handle any situation, ignoring Harry's concern about the seriousness of the attacks at school. He appears unaware or uncaring about the fear spreading through the student body, especially among Muggle-borns who are being targeted. This lack of empathy, this disinterest in the experiences of those without magical lineage, speaks volumes. The way Lockhart treats the threat of the Chamber of Secrets is also noteworthy. While the school is shaken, he continues to stage public appearances and sign autographs, suggesting that his celebrity matters more than the safety of students, especially those from non-magical families. When Justin Finch-Fletchley, a Muggle-born Hufflepuff, is attacked, Lockhart seizes the opportunity not to comfort the students, but to proclaim that he would have stopped it had he arrived sooner. It's not about the victim, it's about his image. And then there's the way he talks about his own magical prowess. Lockhart constantly refers to noble lineages and the burden of being famous. He never outright claims pure blood status, but he leans heavily on the assumption that he belongs to a class of wizards above the rest. There's a scene in Chapter 9 where he lectures Harry on how to handle fame, saying, "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry. Celebrity is as celebrity does. Remember that." He seems to imply that fame is both natural and deserved, particularly for those like himself. The suggestion is that others, especially those from humble beginnings, could never understand. The prejudice becomes more explicit when one reads between the lines of Lockhart's books. While the stories are fabricated, the language he uses is laden with judgments. He refers to a group of trolls as savage brutes and the locals as hopelessly backward. These aren't just throwaway descriptions, they reflect Lockhart's worldview, one where anything outside his understanding is inferior. And because Muggles fall so completely outside the magical sphere he values, it stands to reason that he sees them as lesser beings. Lockhart's dismissiveness of Muggle-borns reaches a peak when he finally faces a real magical challenge. In Chapter 16, when Harry and Ron force him to accompany them into the Chamber of Secrets, he reveals his true colours, not just as a coward, but as a man who thinks only of himself. Faced with danger, he tries to obliviate them both, believing that their memories are expendable, that they, especially Ron, are pureblood, and Harry, who is half-blood but raised by Muggles, can be erased from the narrative so long as his own legend remains intact. The irony, of course, is that Lockhart's downfall is caused by a spell backfiring on him, his own wand, in his own hand. His memory is wiped, and he is left babbling nonsense in St. Mungo's. There's a poetic justice in this. A man who thought so little of others, who saw muggles and muggleborns as beneath notice, is rendered incapable of distinguishing reality at all. And yet, even in his hospital bed, as seen in Order of the Phoenix, he clings to the remnants of fame. He hands out autographed photos to visitors, not understanding why they don't want them. There is something deeply sad in this, not because Lockhart lost his memory, but because even stripped of his cunning, the shallow core of his character remained. His prejudice wasn't just a performance, it was embedded in his view of the world. He didn't hate muggles loudly, he dismissed them quietly. He didn't sneer at muggleborns in front of the class, he patronized them under the guise of charm. And somehow that made it worse. What Lockhart reveals about the wizarding world is uncomfortable. He is not a Death Eater. He doesn't wave the banner of blood purity, but he still perpetuates the same hierarchies, just with a smile. In doing so, he reflects the subtle prejudices that linger even among those who claim to be above it. His vanity isn't just about looks. It's about his place in a world where magical birthright still matters. Readers who look closely will notice that Lockhart's snobbery extends to his interactions with the staff as well. He often interrupts Professor McGonagal, contradicts Professor Snape, and speaks down to Madame Pomfrey. While these are powerful magical figures, none of them rely on self-promotion. Perhaps that's why Lockhart finds them so threatening. They represent genuine skill and humility, qualities that his shallow bravado cannot replicate. And for muggleborns like Hermione, who mirror that quiet competence, Lockhart's disdain becomes even more evident. The films softened many of Lockhart's traits, turning him into comic relief. Kenneth Branagh's performance is delightful, but it veils the darker undertones. The film omits his most problematic comments and glosses over his imperialist language. Viewers see a buffoon, readers see a man propped up by a world that rewards charm over substance, and prejudice cloaked in poetry. In the end, Lockhart's attitude toward muggles and muggleborns is not just a personal flaw, it's a societal mirror. He is a product of a world where magical bloodlines still confer unspoken power. He never had to say he despised muggles, he only had to act as if their ways were laughable, their achievements unworthy, their presence a background detail in his grand narrative. Lockhart remains one of the series' most quietly sinister characters, not because he was evil, but because he was indifferent. Indifferent to truth, to justice, to those without his platform. And that indifference, masked by charm and perfume, is far more dangerous than any open threat, for it is harder to fight what hides behind a smile. Number 25. How he became famous. Few names in the wizarding world inspire such a peculiar mix of admiration and disdain as Gilderoy Lockhart. His shimmering smile, platinum curls, and shelves packed with best-selling memoirs once dazzled the public. But beneath the glitter of fame lay a truth so meticulously hidden that it shocked even the professors of Hogwarts. While the films gave us a charming charlatan whose memory charm backfired, they missed the layered portrait painted by J.K. Rowling in the books, that of a schoolboy with average skills, a bottomless need for praise, and a willingness to rewrite reality itself to suit his image. At Hogwarts, Lockhart's brilliance was never academic. He struggled with practical magic, often causing more harm than good in charms class, and in defense against the dark arts, he was notoriously inept. As Professor Flitwick once noted, he lacked the depth of understanding necessary for serious spell work. He was, at best, forgettable, except for his uncanny ability to draw attention. Where others saw the grandeur of magical theory, Lockhart saw an audience. His every move was calculated to draw eyes. By his 5th year, he had sent over 100 signed photographs to fellow students, expecting them to beg for more. They didn't. He craved recognition in the same way a starving man craves food. Yet the magic he truly mastered was not the kind taught in classrooms, it was the manipulation of perception. He understood, even as a student, that truth was malleable in the hands of a convincing narrator. When his invention of a hair care potion turned out to be a dud that dyed a student's scalp purple, he spun the event into a tale of accidental brilliance, claiming he had uncovered a potion that enhanced magical connectivity through the follicles. In truth, it had been a careless mistake. But the story sold better. Upon leaving Hogwarts, Gilderoy Lockhart was not the star he longed to be. His newts were unimpressive, and he lacked the credentials for any respected magical position. But where others saw a closed door, Lockhart saw opportunity, not in hard work, but in shortcuts. He began to travel, or so his books claimed. The stories told in Voyages with Vampires and Travels with Trolls became instant classics filled with daring escapes, dazzling duels, and acts of valor so outlandish they stretched believability. And yet readers believed, because the true genius of Lockhart lay in his ability to sell the illusion with conviction, and more darkly, with magic. In truth, these were not his stories. Lockhart sought out real heroes, obscure witches and wizards who had performed astonishing feats in remote corners of the world. He listened, smiled, and waited. Then he obliviated them. A well-placed memory charm erased their deeds from their own minds. "What's the point of being famous?" he would later write in Magical Me, "if you're not the one everyone remembers?" In this chilling confession, disguised as humour, lies the cornerstone of his legacy. Fame not earned, but stolen. One of his earliest and most audacious thefts involved an elderly witch named Olda Zelenka from the Czech Republic. Olda had single-handedly defended a Muggle village from a rampaging chimera using an advanced binding hex combined with protective runes. She had lived through fire, teeth, and claw, but not through Lockhart's charm. Gilderoy arrived weeks later under the guise of a writer documenting magical heroes. When he left, Olda remembered nothing of the event. Lockhart returned to Britain with a new chapter for Year with the Yeti, in which he claimed to have fought the beast using a singing hex of his own invention. It didn't take long before his books dominated wizarding households. His good looks and showmanship made him a perfect guest for Witch Weekly, which awarded him Most Charming Smile 5 years in a row. Children begged for his autograph and parents trusted his advice. He released a line of self-care products, endorsed wands, and offered public lectures. Behind the scenes, however, a growing list of missing or memory-damaged wizards and witches dotted the globe, their tales hijacked, their lives quietly erased from history. Lockhart's ego expanded with each success. He began to believe in the persona he had crafted. The line between truth and invention blurred. When he wrote Break with a Banshee, he described a banshee whose scream melted glass and turned mirrors black. The true incident, recorded in the archives of the Department of Magical Creatures, involved a young Irish wizard named Colm Fury, who had lured the creature away from a Muggle village with a musical charm passed down in his family. Lockhart's only role was erasing Colm's memory and taking his place in the tale. Even his signature spell, the memory charm, was not an innovation, but a refinement. Gilderoy had spent years perfecting it, not for academic interest, but for practical use. He needed it to be undetectable, irreversible, and effective on any subject. His obsession with the charm's power bordered on pathological. He didn't just want credit, he wanted exclusivity over the truth. Every heroic act he claimed came with a magical body count, not of deaths, but of stolen lives. His teaching position at Hogwarts was not born of merit. Professor Dumbledore, in need of a defense against the dark arts teacher and under pressure to fill the post, saw in Lockhart a celebrity who might momentarily distract the public from the curse that plagued the position. He invited Lockhart not for his knowledge, but for the spectacle. Lockhart accepted immediately, seeing the role as a chance to cement his legacy among the youth. But Hogwarts was not the book tour circuit. It was a place of scrutiny, of real magic and real danger. Faced with students like Hermione Granger, who quickly saw through his facade and practical tests that exposed his incompetence, Lockhart floundered. His classroom lessons were disasters. The Cornish pixie debacle in Chamber of Secrets was not an anomaly, but a reflection of his true abilities. He panicked, lied, and attempted to charm his way out of failure. just as he always had. When the truth finally caught up to him in the form of Harry Potter and Ron Weasley discovering his plan to flee from the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart did what he had always done. He reached for his wand, not to fight, but to erase. "The adventure ends here, boys," he said with a dramatic flair, intending to obliviate them both and vanish. But in his hubris, he used Ron's broken wand. The charm backfired, erasing his own memory instead. It was the ultimate irony. A man who built his legacy by stealing others' memories lost his own. What followed was a quiet fall from grace. The once celebrated author was admitted to St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies and injuries, placed in the Janus Thickey ward, surrounded by long-term patients with irreparable mental conditions. Visitors came less frequently. His smile, once beaming on book covers, became vacant. And yet, in a tragic twist, he remained convinced of his greatness. He continued to sign autographs and talk about future books, unaware that his past had been a fiction of his own making. In Order of the Phoenix, when Harry visits St. Mungo's, he encounters Lockhart again. The encounter is brief but telling. Lockhart is cheerful, friendly, and utterly unaware of who Harry is. "Look," he says proudly, holding up a quill, "they still let me sign autographs." It's a moment filled with sadness, not for the loss of memory, but for the enduring vanity that survived even magical amnesia. Lockhart's tragedy was not his deception, but the emptiness at its core, a life spent crafting a legend at the cost of never becoming one. His story serves as a cautionary tale in the wizarding world, not just about the abuse of memory magic, but about the dangers of chasing fame without substance. Unlike true heroes such as Remus Lupin or Nymphadora Tonks, who lived and fought for others without seeking glory, Lockhart pursued only applause. And in doing so, he left behind a trail of forgotten names, robbed of their rightful place in history. In examining Lockhart's life, we confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of fame. It is not always earned. It can be forged, fabricated, or faked. Lockhart's name once inspired admiration. Now it inspires caution. And while he may never regain his memories, the magical community remembers not the stories he told, but the people he silenced. As readers revisit the books, particularly Chamber of Secrets, they begin to see the signs more clearly. The false modesty, the exaggerated tales, the oblivious self-admiration, they weren't comic relief, but the breadcrumbs of a darker narrative. Rowling never needed to explicitly reveal the scope of Lockhart's deception. She let the readers uncover it themselves bit by bit. It is in many ways her quietest act of brilliance, to hide a warning in plain sight behind a dazzling smile. Lockhart's legacy is not written in his books, for they contain only the echoes of stolen voices. His true story lives in the minds of those who remember the cost of false heroes, and in the silence of those who never got to tell their own. Number 26, Lockhart and Neville Longbottom. In the shimmering corridors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, where portraits whisper and staircases shift with ancient mischief, the second year of Harry Potter's education brought with it a figure both flamboyant and false. Gilderoy Lockhart, with his dazzling smile and violet robes, swept into the defense against the dark arts position with all the subtlety of a peacock at a funeral. He was a man of grand gestures, extravagant tales, and very little substance. To the public he was a hero. To the students he was an enigma. But to some, like Neville Longbottom, he became something else entirely, a source of humiliation cloaked in vanity. Neville, the round-faced boy with a heart full of quiet courage and hands often trembling from self-doubt, was no stranger to failure. Raised by his formidable grandmother Augusta, who constantly compared him to his brilliant parents, the boy arrived at Hogwarts with a shadow already hanging over his small shoulders. He struggled with spells. His wand seemed to have a mind of its own. His toad, Trevor, kept escaping, as if reflecting Neville's own yearning to flee embarrassment. And in his second year, this quiet boy met a new kind of tormentor. Not a Slytherin classmate or a school poltergeist, but a teacher. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling offers a fleeting but powerful glimpse into the toxic dynamic between Lockhart and Neville. The books are filled with characters who belittle or dismiss Neville, but few moments sting as sharply as the scene in which Lockhart berates him in front of his classmates. It is during a lesson meant to help students repair magically damaged objects. As usual, Neville struggles, and Lockhart, instead of offering guidance, resorts to cruelty. "Tut, tut," he says, with theatrical dismay. 5 points from Gryffindor for not trying. Then, in a voice full of affected patience, he delivers the crushing blow. "Really, Longbottom, at this rate, you'll be lucky to pass your end-of-year exams. Honestly, it's not difficult magic. Only the most idle, bone-lazy students can't master it." This moment passes quickly in the text, but it speaks volumes about Lockhart's teaching philosophies, or more accurately, his complete lack of one. Lockhart does not teach, he performs. He does not correct, he criticizes. And Neville, already fragile in confidence, becomes an easy target. What makes this scene particularly bitter is the way Lockhart masks his verbal attack in the tone of encouragement. The words may seem innocuous to the untrained ear, but to a child already steeped in insecurity, they are devastating. Neville's reaction is not described in detail, but the silence that follows the remark echoes loudly through the classroom. We do not need to see Neville cry or flee to understand the impact. Rowling has already laid the groundwork. We know this boy's heart. We have seen him struggle to remember passwords, misplace items, miscast spells. We know how desperately he wants to be good enough. And here is a teacher, a supposed role model, telling him that he is essentially lazy and hopeless, not because he truly believes that, but because it gives Lockhart a moment to shine, a moment to assert superiority, a moment to laugh. This is where the true damage of Lockhart's presence lies. Unlike Snape, whose cruelty is at least grounded in personal history and complexity, Lockhart's disdain for his students is rooted in sheer vanity. He doesn't hate Neville. He simply doesn't care about him. Lockhart's only concern is how he is perceived. And if that means stepping on a boy's dignity, so be it. The tragedy here is not only that Neville is humiliated, but that his suffering is treated as irrelevant in the grand theatre of Lockhart's ego. Rowling's depiction of Lockhart is masterful in its subtlety. She does not need to scream that he is a fraud. She lets his behavior reveal it. His interaction with Neville is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern. He is equally dismissive of Hermione's genuine curiosity, Harry's fame, and Ron's frustration. But Neville, being the most visibly vulnerable, bears the brunt. It's as though Lockhart sees in Neville the perfect contrast, a boy who is everything he pretends not to be, clumsy, honest, and invisible. And yet there is an irony that makes this dynamic even more poignant. Lockhart's magic, as we later learn, is all borrowed. He has stolen the stories of others, altered memories to suit his purposes, and built a career on deception. Neville, in contrast, is authentically himself. Awkward, yes, but also brave, loyal, and kind. In time, Neville will grow into a hero. He will stand before Voldemort. He will wield the sword of Gryffindor. He will destroy the final Horcrux. But in his second year, that path is still hidden beneath layers of self-doubt, layers that Lockhart's words help to thicken. The scene between Lockhart and Neville also sheds light on how dangerous incompetent authority can be. Hogwarts, for all its magic and wonder, often fails its most vulnerable students. Lockhart's appointment is a mistake born of desperation, Dumbledore's need to fill a cursed position, but its consequences are very real. It's not just about misfired spells or mismanaged classes, it's about trust, it's about safety. When students like Neville are mocked instead of nurtured, they begin to believe they are the problem. They stop trying, they retreat. Neville's journey is in many ways the quietest yet most powerful arc in the series. He begins as comic relief, the boy who forgets everything, who trips over his robes, who blows up his cauldron. But book by book he evolves, he joins Dumbledore's army, he stands up to friends and enemies alike. He becomes a symbol of uncelebrated strength. And when we look back on moments like his encounter with Lockhart, we realize how much he had to overcome, not just Death Eaters, but dismissive teachers, cruel classmates, and his own fear of failure. Lockhart, on the other hand, ends where he deserves, in the Janus Thicky ward at St. Mungo's Hospital, memory shattered by his own backfiring spell. There is a poetic justice in that. The man who stole memories is left without his own. The man who humiliated others is rendered harmless, and perhaps, in that empty gaze, there is a hint of the man he could have been, if he had chosen honesty over applause. It is tempting to dismiss Lockhart as comic relief. He is ridiculous, flamboyant, and hopelessly out of his depth. But to do so is to miss the darkness beneath the glitter. He is not just a bad teacher, he is a warning. A reminder that charisma is not competence, that charm does not equal kindness, and that behind every theatrical smile there may be a person willing to wound others for the sake of applause. Neville's silence in the face of Lockhart's insult is one of many silent sufferings he endures. He rarely speaks up. He rarely fights back. But he remembers. And it is this quiet resilience that defines him. Where Lockhart needs adoration to feel alive, Neville needs only courage. Not the loud kind, but the kind that endures humiliation and still shows up the next day. There is one moment in the Order of the Phoenix that casts a long shadow back to this earlier humiliation. In the Room of Requirement, under the guidance of Harry, Neville practices spells with a determination that is almost painful to watch. He has grown, he has found purpose, but the ghosts of Lockhart's mockery, and others like him, linger in the corners. Every success Neville achieves is layered with memories of failure, and that makes each victory all the more precious. Lockhart's downfall is complete by the time we reach the final books. He is forgotten by the wizarding world he once courted. His books gather dust. His awards mean nothing. And yet Neville's triumph is quiet but enduring. He never becomes a headline. He never writes a memoir. But he becomes the kind of man who plants hope like a seed and watches it grow. He becomes the teacher Lockhart never was, not at Hogwarts, but in his actions, in his steadfast heart. The legacy of Lockhart's cruelty is a reminder that every careless word can leave a mark. Teachers have power, and with it, responsibility. When that power is wielded with ego rather than empathy, students suffer. Neville's story is one of recovery from such wounds. Not immediate, not easy, but real. And that recovery is a kind of magic in itself. So let us not forget this moment, this small, cruel sentence hurled across a classroom. It matters. It mattered to Neville. And it matters to us, because in the world of Hogwarts, as in our own, the true measure of a person is not in the applause they receive, but in the way they treat those who have none. Number 27, fear of being found out. Of all the colourful characters who pass through the doors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, none wear a mask quite so dazzling and fragile as Gilderoy Lockhart. Known to the wizarding world as a best-selling author, charming celebrity, and supposedly accomplished adventurer, Lockhart struts through his role as defense against the dark arts professor with glittering robes, bleached teeth, and an ego the size of the Forbidden Forest. But hidden beneath the surface of his flamboyant performances lies a darker, more human truth, a deep and suffocating fear of being exposed. This is not mere vanity or simple cowardice. It is a consuming dread of losing the illusion, of being unmasked before a world that adores him. That fear defines him, fuels him, and ultimately breaks him. Throughout Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling offers subtle but piercing glimpses into Lockhart's inner world. These glimpses are often veiled in humour or buried beneath the chaos of magical misadventures, but when pieced together, they form a vivid portrait of a man whose entire life is a desperate attempt to silence the truth. Lockhart is not simply afraid of danger, he is terrified of discovery, and that fear governs every word he utters and every step he takes. From the moment he first appears, Lockhart is a spectacle. On the platform at Flourish and Blots, where he stages a book signing, he seizes the opportunity to pose with Harry Potter, ensuring that photographers capture their encounter. "Celebrity is as celebrity does," he beams, forcing copies of his books into Harry's unwilling hands. Yet this theatrical confidence masks something brittle. Lockhart knows he lacks real substance, so he doubles down on style. His teeth, famously described as gleaming white, are magically maintained. His robes, often in lurid shades of lilac or turquoise, scream for attention. But the louder he shines, the more one senses a man afraid of silence. Even his teaching methods are drenched in misdirection. On his first day in the classroom, Lockhart quizzes students not on magical theory or dark creatures, but on trivia about himself, his favorite color, lilac, his secret ambition to rid the world of evil and market a line of hair care potions. It is an absurd and self-absorbed exercise, but one rooted in fear. He cannot teach what he does not know. His supposed encounters with werewolves and banshees are fictions lifted from the lives of real witches and wizards, lives he has stolen and then erased with memory charms. This act of theft, this rewriting of others' bravery, is not just deceit, it is a shield. Lockhart's greatest fear is not that someone might doubt him, it's that someone might remember, that someone might survive the charm, that someone might tell the story the way it really happened. And so he must keep talking, keep smiling, keep dazzling, because if he stops, the silence might reveal what he truly is, a fraud. When the Chamber of Secrets is opened and students begin to fall into enchanted comas, the school is consumed by fear and confusion. Lockhart, however, does not retreat from the spotlight. Instead, he insists upon being seen. He declares himself the man for the job, the only one capable of confronting the monster. "I must ask you not to disturb me," he tells the professors pompously. "I've just had an idea that I must write down immediately." But even in this moment of supposed inspiration, he avoids action. He retreats to his office, not to strategize, but to escape scrutiny. Behind the closed doors of that office, Lockhart's mask begins to slip. His shelves are lined with portraits of himself in heroic poses on a broomstick, wielding a sword, riding a unicorn. The room is a shrine to his image, and its function is clear: to keep him surrounded by the version of himself he wants to believe in. The real Lockhart, the man behind the smile, is rarely present. When he is nervous, jumpy, and evasive. He avoids specifics. He changes the subject. He fills the air with compliments and jokes. But Lockhart's greatest test comes not from the basilisk, but from two boys barely 12 years old. When Harry and Ron confront him in his office and demand that he accompany them to the chamber, the professor crumbles. This is the moment Rowling lays his fear bare. Lockhart fumbles, stalls, then attempts to flee. He grabs his wand not to fight the monster, but to erase their memories, to silence the witnesses. It is not an act of self-preservation, it is an act of erasure. He would rather destroy their knowledge than face the truth. The scene in the bathroom, moments before the entrance to the chamber is revealed, is Lockhart's breaking point. Surrounded by the remains of his lies, with no audience left to deceive, he panics. He attempts to cast his favorite charm, Obliviate, but the spell backfires spectacularly. In a moment of poetic justice, the man who built his life on false memories becomes a man with none. His wand had snapped, the book tells us, and he was looking down at it, stunned. The irony is devastating. The very tool he used to steal his identity betrays him in the end. But even before this final collapse, there are signs of Lockhart's deep psychological distress. At the dueling club, when Draco Malfoy casts a snake at Harry, it is Professor Snape, not Lockhart, who steps in. Lockhart tries to intervene with a flourish, but his spell backfires again, hurling him backward. The laughter of the students only deepens his desperation. He wants to be seen as a savior, but he cannot even play the part. It is not incompetence alone, it is fear of being found out. Every failure brings the risk of exposure, and that terrifies him more than any monster. Rowling gives us another glimpse into his psyche during Valentine's Day. when he floods the school with dwarfs dressed as cupids delivering singing telegrams. It is a grotesque spectacle, a desperate attempt to stay relevant and adored. His fixation with popularity is pathological. It is not enough to be liked, he must be worshipped. Because if the applause stops, the truth might creep in. He cannot allow that. Even his interactions with the other staff reveal his insecurity. McGonagal treats him with thinly veiled disdain. Snape is openly contemptuous, yet Lockhart pretends not to notice. He forces friendship, offers unsolicited advice, and insists upon his expertise. "If I had been here when this monster was released," he says more than once, "none of this would have happened." The refrain is familiar. It is the language of someone rewriting the present to match the fiction of the past. And yet, one cannot help but feel a flicker of pity for him. Lockhart is not a villain in the traditional sense. He does not seek to harm for the sake of power or cruelty. He is a man who has built his entire identity on a lie and now lives in fear that the truth will destroy him. That fear consumes him. It is written in the tremble of his hands, the crack in his voice, the frantic energy behind every boast. He is not evil. He is terrified. The tragedy of Gilderoy Lockhart is not that he loses his memory. It is that he was never able to face it. In many ways, he is the ghost of who he pretended to be, a hollow echo of heroes more worthy than himself. The wizarding world adored him, bought his books, cheered his appearances, but no one knew the real man. Perhaps he did not know himself. Rowling crafts this arc with subtle brilliance. Lockhart's undoing is not a climactic duel or a grand betrayal. It is his own fragility. The moment his lie is challenged, he implodes. That moment when Ron and Harry push him toward the truth is more devastating than any curse. It forces him to confront the one thing he's run from his entire life, reality. And in that confrontation he fails, not because he is weak, but because the myth is too heavy. He has carried it for too long. His back is bent beneath it. His voice is strained from repeating it. When it shatters, he is left with nothing but fragments, and not even the memory to mourn them. Lockhart's story is a cautionary tale, not just for the wizarding world, but for ours. It is a reminder of what happens when image overtakes identity, when fear replaces truth. His robes, his charm, his best-selling books, all of them are decorations on an empty shell. In the end, they are not enough. In St. Mungo's hospital for magical maladies and injuries, we see him again, years later. He is smiling, still signing autographs on scraps of paper, still surrounded by images of himself. But now the mask is not a lie, it is all that remains. "He talks a lot," says the healer kindly. "He's harmless. The truth is more heartbreaking. He is forgotten, even to himself. And perhaps that is the deepest fear of all. Not just to be exposed, but to be erased. To lose not only the lie, but the self beneath it. Lockhart feared the truth, but the void was worse. He once feared being known. Now he will never be." Number 28 knew nothing about the dark arts. There is perhaps no figure in the entire Harry Potter series whose presence is more ironically tragic and hilariously absurd than that of Gilderoy Lockhart. Appointed as the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor for Harry Potter's second year at Hogwarts, Lockhart quickly established himself as a man of glamour, charm, and self-advertised greatness. Yet beneath the cascade of golden curls and the dazzling smile lay the most glaring contradiction of all. The man knew absolutely nothing about the dark arts, not just very little, not just lacking in experience, nothing. And that fact, more than anything else, transformed him from a mere charlatan into one of J.K. Rowling's most biting satirical creations. The books make it painfully clear that Lockhart's ignorance wasn't simply incompetence, it was an active, deliberate fraud. He didn't stumble into teaching through a misunderstanding of his qualifications. He climbed to that position through a ladder built from stolen glory, false memoirs, and an utter lack of shame. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, we watch this unravel with increasing absurdity as Lockhart flounders through lessons lectures and disasters that showcase how detached he is from anything remotely resembling real defensive magic. His first lesson was a warning sign so bright it could have been seen from the top of the astronomy tower. Lockhart unleashed a cage of Cornish pixies on his second-year students, creatures known for their chaotic and unpredictable nature, without the faintest clue how to manage them. The pixies immediately wreaked havoc, lifting Neville Longbottom by the ears and shredding books and papers across the room.
Lockhart's idea of dealing with them? "Pesky pixie pestinomi!" he shouted, waving his wand in a wide arc. The spell, completely fabricated and non-functional, had no effect whatsoever. He then fled the room, leaving Hermione Granger to perform the magic necessary to control the situation. "Why can't he control them?" Ron muttered, watching Lockhart run. The answer was simple, because he had no idea how. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. Lockhart's textbooks, required reading for the course, were his own memoirs, such as Magical Me, Gadding with Ghouls, and Holidays with Hags. Each of them detailed grand adventures in which Lockhart single-handedly defeated banshees, outwitted werewolves, or banished dark spirits, and yet, under the slightest scrutiny, the truth leaked out. His stories were filled with inconsistencies, missing logic, and in some cases complete magical impossibilities. Hermione, one of the most diligent students at Hogwarts, devoured his books in preparation for class, only to find that the supposed lessons within were little more than shallow anecdotes and theatrical flair. Lockhart's lessons were often devoted to readings from his own books, followed by quizzes entirely focused on his personal preferences and accomplishments. One such quiz included questions like, "What is Gilderoy Lockhart's favorite color, and what is Gilderoy Lockhart's secret ambition?" Students were expected to know he liked lilac and dreamed of receiving the Order of Merlin, first class for services to the magical community. Not a single question pertained to curses, hexes, or defense strategies. The fact that this farce passed as curriculum made a mockery of Hogwarts' standards, and Dumbledore's choice to hire him becomes all the more puzzling when one remembers that this was the Defense Against the Dark Arts position, a subject critical to student safety. Lockhart's incompetence extended far beyond the classroom. When Harry's arm was broken during a Quidditch match against Slytherin, Lockhart rushed to the scene with theatrical bravado. "Not to worry, Harry, I will fix that arm of yours straight away." He flourished his wand and vanished all the bones in Harry's arm. The boy was left with a rubbery, boneless limb and required an overnight stay in the hospital wing where Madame Pomfrey had to painstakingly regrow the bones one by one. "I can mend bones in a heartbeat," she said coldly, "but growing them back—" "You will be spending the night, Potter." She then glared at Lockhart. I should have known better. But how did Lockhart manage to rise to such prominence without knowing even the basics? The answer lies in the heart of his deceit. Lockhart was a master of one magical skill: memory charms. He used these to erase the memories of real witches and wizards who had actually performed the heroic deeds he later claimed as his own. In the climactic scene in the Chamber of Secrets, he finally confesses to Harry and Ron. "It's really quite simple. I gather the stories, embellish them a bit, and then perform a memory charm on the unfortunate fellow who did all the hard work." He revealed without remorse that he had done this to an entire series of accomplished magical folk: an old Armenian warlock who had fought a werewolf, a witch in Bath who banished a banshee, and many others. Each one was robbed not only of their memories, but of their rightful place in magical history. Lockhart didn't just lie, he destroyed lives for fame. He wasn't a fool as much as he was a villain in disguise, wrapped in cologne and peacock blue robes. And yet, ironically, despite his ignorance, Lockhart was loved by many. His fan mail poured in daily. Witches across Britain idolized him. He won Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile award 5 times in a row. He was the very embodiment of style over substance, proof that charisma and a good smile could obscure a complete lack of depth. He used his fame not just to sell books, but to market magical hair care products, self-portraits, and other Lockhart-themed merchandise.
He understood the art of illusion, not magical illusion, but social illusion, and played it to perfection. Even his fellow teachers knew the truth. Professor Snape, with his characteristic disdain, constantly undermined Lockhart's claims. During the dueling club session, Snape easily disarmed Lockhart with a flick of his wand. Lockhart spun and crashed to the ground in a heap, and when Draco Malfoy conjured a snake during the same session, Lockhart stepped forward, boasting that he would remove it. Instead, his attempt only sent the serpent flying into the air and crashing back down, angrier than ever. It was Harry who ultimately stopped the snake, using Parseltongue to everyone's horror. The culmination of Lockhart's fraudulent career came when he tried to wipe Harry and Ron's memories in the Chamber of Secrets with Ron's broken wand. The spell backfired violently and obliterated Lockhart's own memory. The irony was poetic. A man who made his career by stealing others' memories was now left without his own. The final glimpse we get of him is in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, where he resides in St. Mungo's Hospital for magical maladies, blissfully unaware of who he is, signing autographs with a dreamy smile and no idea why people remember him. What makes Lockhart such a fascinating character isn't just that he was a fraud, but that he was so thoroughly a fraud he didn't even try to learn the real subject he was hired to teach. Most charlatans make an effort to maintain the illusion, studying enough to pass for legitimate. Lockhart had no such ambition. He relied entirely on charm and manipulation. Even his spells were often incorrect. "I must ask you not to scream. It might provoke them," he told students during the pixie debacle, as though that were the key to spell work. Lockhart was a mirror held up to a society obsessed with appearances. Rowling's decision to place him in a position of real power at the heart of a school wasn't accidental. It was a commentary on how fame, charm, and a well-polished image can allow someone utterly unqualified to reach positions of influence. Even Hermione, brilliant and skeptical, was briefly taken in by his glamour. It wasn't until she saw him fail, again and again, that the illusion shattered. There's a kind of brilliance in how Lockhart's fraudulence is slowly revealed. Rowling doesn't shout it from the start. Instead, we see the unraveling. Each mistake, each lie, each absurd claim chips away at the image he projects. By the time he tries to wipe the boy's memories, the audience already knows the spell won't work. Not just because of Ron's wand, but because Lockhart, at his core, is incapable, not just morally, but magically. What makes Lockhart's story particularly tragic is the waste. He was a talented wizard in one very narrow field. His skill with memory charms was genuinely impressive, but instead of using that skill to contribute something meaningful, he chose deceit. He chose to silence the voices of true heroes and speak in their place. It wasn't just ignorance that defined Lockhart, it was theft, vanity, and cowardice. Yet even in his downfall, he remains bizarrely endearing. There is something almost childlike in his delusions post-memory loss. He is no longer dangerous, no longer a threat. He signs photos of himself to people he doesn't recognize, believing they still admire him. There is a strange peace in that. The mask has become the man. The final irony. Rowling used Lockhart to remind readers that knowledge, substance, and truth are more important than image. In a world filled with dark wizards, ancient curses, and deadly beasts, the greatest threat at times isn't external, but internal. It's the elevation of falsehood to authority. Lockhart wasn't a Death Eater. He never cast an unforgivable curse. But in many ways, his brand of harm, subtle, insidious, and smiling, was just as damaging. In the end, Lockhart's presence at Hogwarts wasn't just comic relief. It was a lesson to the students, to the readers, and perhaps even to Dumbledore himself. For all his cleverness, even Albus made the mistake of choosing a man with style over substance, and in doing so, he unleashed a teacher who couldn't teach, a wizard who couldn't cast, and a hero who never was.